Close your eyes, breathe slowly. Tonight we travel to the palaces and ballrooms of Imperial Russia, to the gilded halls of the Winter Palace, where Tsars received the homage of a sixth of the Earth's surface, to the amber rooms and frozen lakes of a civilization of extraordinary splendor, built on the suffering of millions of serfs, to the family that ruled the largest empire in history for 3 centuries, and whose final members were murdered in a basement in Yekaterinburg on a July night in 1918. Ending a dynasty whose story contains within it every human element: love and power, faith and madness, extraordinary courage and catastrophic blindness, the specific grandeur of an empire at its height and the specific horror of its collapse. This is the story of the Romanovs. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 1. The dynasty that ruled a sixth of the world. The Romanov dynasty, the imperial family that ruled Russia from February 1613, when the 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov was elected Tsar by a national assembly convened to end the time of troubles, to March 1917, when Nicholas II abdicated in a railway carriage outside Pskov, and the 300-year imperial experiment ended with a stroke of a pen, governed the largest continuous land empire in the history of the world. A state that at its greatest extent in the 19th century covered approximately 22.8 million square kilometers, spanning 11 time zones from the Baltic Sea in the west to the Pacific coast of Siberia in the east, from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the borders of Persia and China in the south, and encompassing within its borders approximately 125 million subjects of extraordinary ethnic, linguistic, religious, and cultural diversity. The Romanov Empire was a world unto itself, a civilization that contained within its borders more territorial variety than any other political unit in human history, governed by a dynasty whose specific character, whose specific beliefs about the nature of political authority and the relationship between the Tsar and his people, shaped every dimension of Russian life for 3 centuries in ways whose consequences the 20th century would make catastrophically clear. The story of the Romanovs is not merely a story about a royal family. It is a story about the specific form of absolute power, the belief that the Tsar was God's anointed representative on earth, responsible to no human institution and accountable only to the divine will, and about what happens to that belief when the world changes around it faster than the institution can adapt. The Romanovs produced military conquerors and enlightened reformers, mystics and modernizers, patrons of extraordinary art and perpetrators of systematic oppression. They built Saint Petersburg from a Baltic swamp and filled it with palaces whose specific splendor announced to the world that Russia was a European civilization of the first rank. They also maintained serfdom, a system of human bondage barely distinguishable from slavery, until 1861, 2 years before Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed the enslaved people of the American South. The grandeur and the cruelty were inseparable, 2 expressions of the same absolute power that no constitutional framework constrained and no representative institution checked. Understanding the Romanovs requires holding both of these truths simultaneously, the beauty of what they built and the human cost of building it, because the dynasty's specific tragedy was that it could not hold them simultaneously itself, and that its refusal to acknowledge the cost eventually made the beauty unsustainable. Fact 2. The time of troubles, how the Romanovs came to power. The specific circumstances that brought the Romanov dynasty to power in 1613 were the circumstances of a Russia that had just survived approximately 15 years of political catastrophe, the time of troubles, a period of dynastic crisis, foreign invasion, famine, and social collapse that had reduced the Russian state to near dissolution and left its population so exhausted and so desperate for stability that the election of a 16-year-old boy from a minor noble family as Tsar was welcomed as a restoration of order rather than questioned as an appointment of a child to the most powerful office in the world. The time of troubles had begun with the death of the last ruler of the Rurikid dynasty, Ivan the Terrible's son Fyodor, in 1598, and had been characterized by a rapid succession of disputed claimants, foreign pretenders, peasant uprisings, and the military intervention of Poland-Lithuania, which at one point occupied Moscow itself and placed a Polish prince on the Russian throne. The specific suffering of the Russian population during this period, famine conditions produced by the volcanic winter following the eruption of the Peruvian volcano Huaynaputina in 1600, which disrupted harvests across the northern hemisphere, the violence of competing armies marching back and forth across the Russian countryside, and the specific terror of a society that had lost its legitimate political framework, was so severe that the population of Russia declined by approximately a third during the time of troubles. The Zemsky Soba, the National Assembly of clergy, nobility and townspeople, that elected Mikhail Romanov Tsar in February 1613 chose him partly because of his family connection through his aunt Anastasia to Ivan the Terrible's first wife, providing a thin thread of dynastic legitimacy to the new family's claim, and partly because his youth and his family's relatively modest political standing made him acceptable to the competing factions of the Russian nobility, each of which calculated that a young and inexperienced Tsar would be easier to manage than a more powerful figure. Neither calculation proved entirely correct in the long run. The Romanov dynasty that Mikhail founded would prove considerably more durable and considerably more powerful than the nobles who elected him in 1613 had intended. The dynasty lasted 300 years and produced Tsars who redefined what Russian power could be, before the specific combination of 19th century social change and early 20th century political crisis produced the catastrophe that ended it. Fact 3. Peter the Great, the Tsar who dragged Russia into the modern world. Peter the Great, Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov, born June 9, 1672, Tsar from 1682 and Emperor from 1721, died February 8, 1725, was the most transformative single ruler in the history of the Romanov dynasty and one of the most consequential monarchs in the history of the modern world. A man of physical dimensions as extraordinary as his political ambition, standing approximately 2 meters and 5 centimeters tall in a century when the average European male stood approximately 1 meter 65, possessed of an energy and a curiosity and a specific impatience with the Russia he had inherited that drove him to the most radical top-down modernization project any ruler had attempted since the Roman emperors. Peter inherited a Russia that was, by the standards of the Western European civilization he admired and envied, technologically backward, administratively chaotic, culturally isolated, and militarily inadequate. It had no navy, no modern artillery, no engineering corps, and no administrative structure capable of organizing the resources of the enormous empire efficiently. Its nobility wore the traditional long-bearded dress of Muscovite tradition, its church maintained medieval practices, and its orientation was toward the Orthodox Christian East rather than the secular rationalist West that was producing the scientific revolution and the political philosophy whose consequences would define the next 3 centuries. Peter spent the years between 1697 and 1698 traveling through Western Europe incognito as part of the Grand Embassy, a diplomatic mission he joined in disguise, working in Dutch and English shipyards as a carpenter to learn naval construction firsthand, visiting factories and anatomical theaters and artillery foundries, absorbing the specific technical knowledge of a civilization he was determined to transplant into Russia wholesale. What he brought back was not merely technology, but a vision of Russia as a European power whose transformation required the dismantling of every traditional institution that stood between the country and the modern state he intended to create. He forced the Russian nobility to shave their beards and adopt Western dress, reorganized the Russian Orthodox Church under state control, built Saint Petersburg from nothing on the swampy shores of the Baltic as a new capital that would look westward rather than eastward, created Russia's first navy, reformed the army on Western European lines, introduced the Julian calendar, established the first Russian newspaper, and founded institutions of learning that Russia had never previously possessed. The specific brutality with which he pursued these transformations, the torture and execution of those who resisted, including his own son Alexei, whom he had imprisoned and who died under interrogation, was the specific brutality of a man who understood that Russia's survival as an independent civilization required transformation faster than any voluntary process could achieve, and who was prepared to pay any human price to achieve it. Fact 4. The Winter Palace, the heart of imperial power. The Winter Palace in Saint Petersburg, the enormous Baroque building on the south bank of the Neva River, whose turquoise and white facade stretches approximately 230 meters along the river embankment, whose approximately 1,500 rooms include ballrooms of such extravagant scale that the most spectacular of them, the Jordan Staircase, uses the entire visual depth of the building to create an effect of ascending grandeur, whose specific intention was to communicate the overwhelming power of the regime it housed, was the primary residence of the Russian emperors from its completion under Empress Elizabeth in 1762 to the Revolution of 1917, the physical center of the Romanov Empire, and one of the most spectacular royal residences ever built anywhere in the world. The palace that stands today is the 4th building on the site, the first 3 having been demolished or destroyed and replaced by successively more ambitious versions as the dynasty's wealth and ambition grew, and was designed by the Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli in the high Baroque style that the Empress Elizabeth demanded as the appropriate visual language for a Russia that intended to announce its status as the equal of any European court. Its specific scale was a political statement as much as an aesthetic one. At the time of its completion, the Winter Palace was the largest building in Europe, a physical expression of the Romanov dynasty's specific understanding that the architecture of power must overwhelm the viewer's capacity for comparison. The palace's interiors were as lavish as its exterior was imposing: galleries of malachite and gilded bronze, floors of inlaid parquet whose patterns covered thousands of square meters, ceilings painted by the greatest decorative artists of Europe, and collections of art assembled over 2 centuries that formed the nucleus of what would become the Hermitage Museum, one of the greatest art collections in the world. The specific human cost of the Winter Palace's construction and maintenance, the tens of thousands of serfs and workers who built it, the legions of servants who maintained it, the enormous portion of the imperial budget that its upkeep consumed, was the specific human cost of a civilization organized around the absolute comfort and absolute magnificence of the family at its apex. Fact 5. Catherine the Great, the German princess who became Russia's greatest empress. Catherine the Great, born Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst on May 2, 1729 in Stettin, Prussia, a minor German princess of no particular political significance, who came to Russia at the age of 15 as the prospective bride of the future Peter III, converted to Orthodoxy, learned Russian with a ferocious dedication that impressed even those who resented her foreignness, and in 1762 organized the coup that deposed her own husband, had him killed, and ruled Russia alone for 34 years, as the most capable and most consequential Romanov ruler since Peter the Great, was the specific demonstration that the Romanov dynasty's power could be held and exercised with extraordinary effectiveness by someone who had not been born into it, whose specific intelligence and specific political genius more than compensated for the specific accident of birth that had denied her the legitimacy her position formally required. Catherine came to power in a coup whose specific swiftness and whose specific bloodlessness, apart from the murder of Peter III, which Catherine later claimed was not carried out on her orders, reflected both her political skill and the specific exhaustion of the Russian nobility, with a Tsar whose eccentricities and pro-Prussian sympathies had alienated virtually every institution capable of sustaining him in power. She governed Russia from 1762 to 1796, presiding over the most dramatic territorial expansion of the empire since Peter the Great, absorbing large portions of Poland, acquiring Crimea and the northern Black Sea coast from the Ottoman Empire, and extending Russian influence into the Caucasus and Central Asia in ways that shaped the political geography of the region for the next 2 centuries. She corresponded with Voltaire, Diderot, and the great philosophers of the French Enlightenment, positioning herself as an enlightened despot whose rule was guided by reason and whose legal reforms, the nakaz, the instructions she wrote for the legislative commission she convened in 1767, drew on Montesquieu and Beccaria to articulate a vision of rational governance that no subsequent Russian ruler implemented as fully as Catherine had articulated it. She also crushed the Pugachev Rebellion of 1773 to 1775, the largest peasant uprising in Russian history, with a severity that demonstrated the specific limits of her enlightened principles when they confronted the specific reality of a social order built on serfdom. Fact 6. The serfs, the human foundation of imperial splendor. The serfs of Imperial Russia, the approximately 34 million human beings who, at the peak of the serf system in the mid-19th century, were legally bound to the land and to the noble landowners who owned that land, unable to move, to marry, to engage in trade, or to take any significant action in their lives without their master's permission, and who could be bought, sold, punished, and in the early period of the system, killed by the men and women who owned them. With a specific human foundation on which the entire splendor of the Romanov imperial civilization rested, the workers whose compelled labor built the palaces and the cities, cultivated the agricultural land that produced the wealth, and provided the domestic service that made the lifestyle of the Russian nobility possible, while living in conditions of poverty and legal subjugation that the most basic principles of the Enlightenment that Catherine claimed to embrace made indefensible. The specific character of Russian serfdom, which had developed from earlier forms of peasant bondage and been progressively tightened by successive Romanov Tsars as the means of securing noble loyalty and military service, was in many respects more severe than the feudal serfdom of medieval Western Europe, from which Western European peasants had largely emerged by the 15th and 16th centuries, and comparable in its practical dimensions to the chattel slavery of the American South. Serfs could be sold separately from the land, gambled away at cards, given as gifts, and subjected to physical punishment at their owner's discretion. The specific forms of resistance available to them, arson, flight, passive non-compliance, and periodic organized uprisings, were met with collective punishment whose severity was intended to discourage repetition. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861, announced by Alexander II in terms that acknowledged the fundamental injustice of the institution, while creating an emancipation settlement, whose specific terms left the freed serfs burdened by redemption payments for land they had previously cultivated without payment, was the most consequential single reform of the Romanov period, and the one whose specific inadequacy contributed most directly to the revolutionary pressures that would eventually destroy the dynasty. Fact 7. The Romanov Palaces, a world of impossible luxury. The imperial palaces of the Romanov dynasty, the Winter Palace in Saint Petersburg, the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo with its legendary Amber Room, the Peterhof complex on the Gulf of Finland with its 64 fountains and 142 water jets that earned it the designation of the Russian Versailles, the Gatchina Palace, the Pavlovsk Palace, and the dozens of other imperial residences distributed across the vast geography of the empire, constituted together the most extensive collection of royal residential architecture in the history of the world, and expressed in their specific splendor the specific understanding of the Romanov rulers that the physical environment of power must be so overwhelming in its beauty and its scale that the mere act of inhabiting it conferred on its occupant a specific aura of the divine. The Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the imperial residence 15 miles south of St. Petersburg that became the favored summer residence of the Romanov court, contains the Amber Room, a chamber whose walls were entirely covered in panels of amber, gold leaf, and mirrors, creating an interior of such warm, glowing, almost supernatural beauty that it was described by contemporaries as the eighth wonder of the world. The original Amber Room, created in Prussia and gifted to Peter the Great by Frederick William I in 1716, was looted by German forces in 1941, dismantled and transporting to Königsberg, where it disappeared, its fate one of the great unsolved mysteries of Second World War art theft. A reconstruction, completed in 2003 using historical photographs and surviving fragments as guides, now occupies the space in the Catherine Palace, giving 21st century visitors the specific visual experience of amber light and gilded, Baroque decoration that the Romanov court took for granted as the appropriate backdrop for imperial life. The Peterhof complex, begun by Peter the Great and expanded by successive rulers, used a system of gravity-fed water channels extending approximately 22 kilometers from the Ropsha Hills to create the largest collection of decorative fountains in the world without any mechanical pumping. A feat of hydraulic engineering whose specific beauty, in the context of the serf labor that built and maintained it, is inseparable from the specific social system that made it possible. Fact 8. Alexander I, the enigmatic Tsar who defeated Napoleon. Alexander I, born December 23, 1777, emperor from 1801 to 1825, the grandson of Catherine the Great and the Tsar who presided over Russia's most significant military triumph and its most consequential diplomatic achievement, was one of the most complex and most contradictory figures in the entire Romanov dynasty. A ruler whose charm and intelligence captivated virtually everyone who encountered him, whose specific political behavior consistently disappointed those who believed those qualities would translate into liberal reform, and whose final years were characterized by a withdrawal from the governing responsibilities of the empire into a mystical religiosity, whose specific character suggested either genuine spiritual crisis or the elaboration of an elaborate personal myth. Alexander came to power in circumstances whose specific moral shadow never fully left him. His father Paul I was murdered in a palace coup on the night of March 23, 1801, by a group of conspirators who included senior officers of the Imperial Guard, and Alexander, who had been aware of the plot, had extracted assurances that his father would not be harmed, assurances that the conspirators did not keep. Whether Alexander's lifelong melancholy and his eventual withdrawal from public life reflected genuine guilt about his father's death, or was simply the expression of a temperament ill-suited to the specific demands of absolute power, is a question that his contemporaries debated and historians have continued to debate. His specific achievement in the Napoleonic Wars, the decision to refuse accommodation with Napoleon after the burning of Moscow in 1812, to continue the war through the Russian winter until French power in Europe was broken, and to lead the coalition that entered Paris in 1814, was one of the most consequential acts of strategic will in modern European history. The specific combination of Russian military endurance, General Kutuzov's strategy of fighting for time rather than position, and Napoleon's catastrophic underestimation of the Russian capacity for national resistance produced the destruction of the Grande Armée and the beginning of Napoleon's final decline. Fact 9. The Decembrist Revolt, the Seeds of Revolution. The Decembrist Revolt of December 14, 1825, the uprising by approximately 3,000 soldiers in Saint Petersburg Senate Square, led by young officers of the Imperial Guard who had been exposed to liberal and constitutional ideas during the Russian army's march through Europe in the Napoleonic Wars, and who seized the occasion of the confused succession following Alexander I's death to demand a constitution and the abolition of serfdom. Was the first organized revolutionary movement in Russian history, and the specific event that established the template of oppositional politics that the Romanov dynasty would struggle to suppress for the next 92 years until revolution finally overwhelmed it. The specific timing of the revolt, occurring in the confused interval between Alexander's death and the formal proclamation of his younger brother Nicholas as Tsar, reflected the conspirators' calculation that political transitions created windows of vulnerability in the autocratic system that determined opposition could exploit. The specific failure of the revolt, the conspirators had planned to present the new Tsar with a constitutional demand backed by military force, but the plan's execution was fatally undermined by the indecision of the leader chosen to command the rebel troops, who spent most of the decisive morning riding back and forth across St. Petersburg, unable to issue the orders that the situation required. Demonstrated both the genuine revolutionary sentiment among sections of the Russian educated class and the specific organizational weakness that would characterize Russian revolutionary movements for decades. Nicholas I, who personally interrogated the leading conspirators, had 5 of them hanged and approximately 100 others exiled to Siberia. But the specific ideas they had expressed, constitutional government, the rule of law, the abolition of serfdom, were not exiled with them. They circulated through the Russian educated class with an underground persistence that no amount of censorship could entirely suppress, and they resurfaced in successive generations of reformers and revolutionaries until they finally achieved political expression in the upheaval of 1905 and the catastrophe of 1917. Fact 10. The Romanovs at 10, a dynasty in its world. 10 facts into the story of the Romanovs, and the dynasty is visible in its full complexity. A family that came to power in the chaos of a national emergency and built over 3 centuries the largest empire in human history, whose rulers ranged from the ferocious modernizing energy of Peter the Great to the contradictions of Alexander I, whose civilization produced palaces of extraordinary beauty and a system of human bondage of extraordinary cruelty, and whose specific understanding of political authority as a divine appointment that required no human validation or institutional check created from the beginning the specific tension that would eventually destroy it. The Romanovs governed in the name of God and by the power of the autocratic tradition, a tradition that made them capable of enormous transformations when the Tsar had the vision and the will to impose them, and incapable of the specific adaptations that constitutional reform would have required, because constitutional reform implied that the Tsar's authority derived from human agreement rather than divine appointment. That specific incapacity would prove fatal. The world that the 19th century created, the world of industrialization, urbanization, nationalist movements, socialist thought, and the specific political expectations of educated populations who had encountered the ideas of the French Revolution, could not indefinitely be governed by the methods of the 17th century autocracy that the Romanovs had inherited and that the most powerful among them had perpetuated. Fact 11. Nicholas I, the Iron Tsar. Nicholas I, born July 6, 1796, emperor from 1825 to 1855, the third son of Paul I, who came to power on the day of the Decembrist revolt, and whose specific experience of that uprising shaped every subsequent political decision of his 30-year reign, was the most thoroughgoing autocrat of the 19th century Romanov dynasty. A man of rigid military bearing, absolute personal conviction, and an almost pathological distrust of liberal ideas, whose specific reign established the repressive apparatus, the third section secret police, the strict censorship regime, the system of surveillance and control over the educated class, that successive Tsars would inherit and whose specific inadequacy as a response to the social forces of the 19th century would become more apparent with each passing decade. Nicholas understood political authority in purely military terms, as a hierarchy of command and obedience in which the Tsar's will was the supreme directive that flowed downward through a chain of subordinates whose function was implementation rather than deliberation. His vision of Russia was of a perfectly ordered state in which every element functioned in its designated role without friction, deviation, or unauthorized initiative, a vision whose specific appeal to a man who had witnessed the chaos of the Decembrist uprising was understandable, but whose specific application to a society of 60 million people undergoing the early stages of industrialization and absorbing the political ideas of the French Revolution was catastrophically inadequate. His reign was defined by three political commitments: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, the official ideology of his minister Sergei Uvarov, whose function was to provide an ideological justification for the specific social order Nicholas was determined to preserve. The specific costs of this preservation were paid by the tens of thousands of Russians who were arrested, exiled, or subjected to military conscription as punishment for political opinions. Among them, the novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was arrested in 1849 for association with a liberal discussion circle, subjected to a mock execution in which he stood before a firing squad before being reprieved at the last moment, and exiled to Siberia for 4 years. Nicholas's reign ended in the specific humiliation of the Crimean War, the conflict in which a modernized Anglo-French alliance exposed the specific technological and administrative backwardness of the Russian military system that his rigid conservatism had preserved, and he died in 1855 in circumstances that some contemporaries believed involved deliberate self-administered poison. His final months consumed by the awareness that his life's political work had produced the catastrophic military failure that would force on his successor the reforms he had spent 30 years preventing. Fact 12. The Crimean War, the humiliation that changed everything. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, the conflict in which Russia fought against an alliance of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia for control of the Black Sea region and the declining territories of the Ottoman Empire, and in which the Russian military was defeated by the specific combination of Allied technological superiority, logistical capacity, and the specific organizational failures of the Russian military system that Nicholas I had spent 30 years preserving against reform, was the most consequential single military defeat in the history of the Romanov dynasty. The event that demonstrated with unmistakable clarity that a Russia governed by 19th century autocratic methods could not compete militarily with the industrialized powers of Western Europe, and that forced on the new Tsar Alexander II the program of reform that his father had refused to contemplate. The war's most famous episode, the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava on October 25, 1854, in which the British light cavalry charged directly into the mouths of Russian artillery through a miscommunication of orders, and lost approximately 278 men in a few minutes of futile gallantry, was celebrated in Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem as an expression of military heroism and entered British cultural memory as an image of noble sacrifice. For Russia, the war's most significant episode was the 11-month siege of Sevastopol, the Russian naval base in Crimea, which the Allied forces surrounded and bombarded in an operation whose specific military character, the extended static siege warfare, the enormous consumption of artillery ammunition, the critical role of railway logistics in supplying the besieging force, presaged the industrial warfare of the First World War and demonstrated that a power without adequate railways, modern artillery, and organized medical services was at a decisive disadvantage against one that possessed all three. Russia's railway network in 1854 was so inadequate that supplying the Sevastopol garrison by land was almost impossible, while the Allies could supply their forces by sea with the full resources of industrialized Britain and France behind them. The Treaty of Paris of 1856, which ended the war, stripped Russia of its naval presence in the Black Sea and its dominant influence over the Ottoman Empire, and delivered to the new Tsar Alexander II the specific political message that reform was no longer optional. Fact 13. Alexander II, the Tsar Liberator. Alexander II, born April 29, 1818, Emperor from 1855 to 1881, the son of Nicholas I, whose specific combination of genuine reforming instinct and specific political caution produced the most significant transformation of Russian society in the 19th century, while simultaneously failing to satisfy the revolutionary movement that the transformation's inadequacy had helped create, was the most significant reforming Tsar of the Romanov dynasty and the one whose specific fate, assassination by a terrorist bomb on March 13, 1881, after surviving 6 previous attempts on his life, illustrated with tragic precision the specific paradox that moderate reform in an autocratic system can produce. The reforms satisfy no one completely, radicalize those who believe they do not go far enough, and alarm the conservative forces who believe they go too far, leaving the reforming Tsar in the specific position of having made enemies on all sides while retaining the full support of none. The Emancipation Reform of 1861, the most consequential single act of legislation in the history of the Romanov dynasty, freeing approximately 23 million serfs from their legal bondage to the land and to the nobles who owned it, was the specific achievement for which Alexander earned the designation Tsar Liberator, and it was a genuine achievement whose specific historical significance should not be minimized by the inadequacy of its implementation. The freed serfs received their personal freedom and allotments of land, but the land allotments were typically smaller than the land they had previously cultivated, and the freed serfs were required to pay redemption payments to the state over a period of 49 years to compensate the nobles for the land transferred to them. The specific result was a rural population that was legally free but economically burdened, that had received enough land to survive on but not enough to prosper, and that remained locked in the communal land tenure system of the mir, the village commune, that the government maintained partly from inertia and partly from the specific fear that individual peasant land ownership would produce the rural class differentiation that might generate revolutionary politics. The subsequent reforms of Alexander's reign, the Zemstvo reform that created elected local government bodies, the judicial reform that established an independent judiciary and trial by jury, the military reform that modernized the army, were genuine and consequential. But they stopped consistently short of the constitutional reform that might have given the Russian political system the institutional flexibility to absorb the social changes that industrialization and urbanization were producing. Fact 14. The assassination of Alexander II, reform's tragic end. The assassination of Alexander II on March 13, 1881, carried out by the revolutionary organization Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will, on the Catherine Canal embankment in Saint Petersburg, in an attack in which the first bomb disabled the Tsar's carriage and killed several bystanders, and the second, thrown by the 25-year-old Ignacy Yekaterinburg as Alexander stepped out to check on the wounded, tore off the lower half of the Tsar's legs and inflicted wounds from which he died within hours, was the specific event that ended the most promising reform period in the history of the Romanov dynasty, and produced in its aftermath a conservative reaction that would delay meaningful constitutional reform for a generation. The specific irony of Alexander's assassination is almost unbearable in retrospect. On the morning of the day he was killed, Alexander had signed a document proving the creation of 2 consultative commissions that would have given elected representatives a formal advisory role in the legislative process for the first time in Russian history, a document that his son and successor Alexander III immediately suppressed upon learning of his father's death. The revolutionary movement that killed Alexander II believed it was striking a blow against autocracy that would trigger a popular uprising. Instead, it produced the opposite, a conservative backlash that strengthened autocracy, intensified repression of revolutionary and liberal movements alike, and delayed the constitutional reforms that Alexander II had been cautiously moving toward. The 5 conspirators who were arrested for the assassination, including Sofia Perovskaya, who had coordinated the attack from the canal bank, and Nikolai Kibalchich, who had designed the bombs, were hanged in a public execution on April 15, 1881, before a crowd of approximately 80,000 people. Alexander II was succeeded by his son Alexander III, who drew from his father's murder the specific lesson that reform was dangerous and repression was necessary, a lesson whose political consequences would compound over the following decades until they became the specific conditions of 1917. Fact 15. Alexander III, the reaction. Alexander III, born March 10, 1845, emperor from 1881 to 1894, the son of the assassinated Alexander II, whose specific response to his father's murder was to reverse virtually every reform his father had introduced, and to intensify the repressive apparatus of the Russian state to a degree that no previous Tsar since Nicholas I had attempted, was the most thoroughgoing reactionary of the late Romanov dynasty. A man of enormous physical size, he reportedly bent iron pokers with his bare hands for the entertainment of his court, and correspondingly enormous personal certainty, whose specific political convictions were as simple and as absolute as his physical presence was overwhelming. Alexander III's response to his father's assassination was immediate, comprehensive, and deliberately designed to send an unmistakable message to every element of Russian society that the era of reform was over. The Statute of State Security gave governors and the police sweeping powers to arrest, exile, and suppress without judicial process any person deemed a threat to public order. The Zemstvo counterreform reduced the powers of the elected local government bodies that Alexander II had created. The University Statutes of 1884 abolished university autonomy and subjected academic life to direct government control. The judicial counter-reform undermined the independence of the judiciary that Alexander II's reforms had established. In the countryside, the institution of the land captain, a government official with broad authority over peasant affairs, effectively restored a form of administrative tutelage over the freed serfs that bore uncomfortable resemblance to the supervision of the pre-emancipation period. The specific ideology that animated these measures was articulated by Alexander's chief advisor Konstantin Pobedonostsev, the procurator of the Holy Synod, whose specific worldview, combination of Orthodox piety, Russian nationalism, and a profound contempt for Western liberal ideas, provided the philosophical framework for a regime whose positive program consisted primarily of the preservation of what existed against the changes that the modern world was producing. Alexander II's Russia was a police state of genuine effectiveness. His reign was the only period in the late 19th century in which the revolutionary movement was substantially suppressed rather than merely driven underground. But the specific price of this effectiveness was the accumulation of political pressures that his son Nicholas II would inherit and prove entirely unequipped to manage. Fact 16. The Imperial Court, a world of ceremony and intrigue. The Imperial Court of the Romanov dynasty, the elaborate ceremonial world that surrounded the Tsar and his family in the Winter Palace and in the summer residences of Tsarskoye Selo and Peterhof, organized around a system of ranks, precedences, and ritual obligations whose specific complexity expressed the dynasty's understanding that the visible performance of power was itself a form of power, was one of the most elaborate and most carefully regulated royal courts in the history of the modern world, a social universe of several thousand people whose entire existence was organized around the person of the emperor and whose specific daily rituals, the winter balls, the Easter ceremonies, the birthday celebrations, the presentations of new officers, the formal receptions of foreign ambassadors, consumed an enormous portion of the imperial family's time and an enormous portion of the imperial budget. The winter season in Saint Petersburg, the period between Christmas and the beginning of Lent, during which the Russian aristocracy gathered in the capital for the season of balls, receptions, and entertainments whose specific splendor was designed to demonstrate the wealth and the cultural sophistication of the imperial civilization, was the social center of the Romanov year. The most important of the winter balls was the Bal de la Noblesse, the nobility ball, held in the Winter Palace's enormous Nicholas Hall, whose white and gold interior could accommodate approximately 3,000 guests and whose specific visual effect, thousands of officers in their dress uniforms, women in white gowns and jewels, the imperial family receiving the guests beneath the enormous crystal chandeliers, was designed to create an overwhelming impression of civilizational grandeur that would leave no participant in doubt about the specific magnificence of the dynasty they were serving. Behind the spectacle lay the specific human realities of court life. Intense competition for positions of proximity to the imperial family, the factional rivalries among the aristocratic families who competed for influence over imperial policy, the gossip and intrigue that were the unavoidable byproducts of a social system in which access to the Tsar was the primary determinant of political and social success, and the specific ennui of intelligent people whose existence was organized around the performance of ritual rather than the exercise of meaningful work. Fact 17. The Trans-Siberian Railway, an empire connected. The Trans-Siberian Railway, the approximately 289-kilometer railway line connecting Moscow to the Russian Pacific port of Vladivostok, whose construction began in 1891 and was substantially completed by 1916, making it the longest railway line in the world and one of the most ambitious engineering projects in the history of the 19th century, was the single most consequential infrastructure investment of the late Romanov dynasty and the specific physical expression of the imperial ambition to bind the enormous eastern territories of the empire into a coherent economic and political whole. The railway's construction was authorized by Alexander III and championed by his finance minister Sergei Witt, who understood with specific clarity that the development of Siberia's enormous natural resources, the timber, the minerals, the agricultural land of the Siberian steppe, required a transport link capable of moving goods and people across the distances involved at a cost and a speed that the existing alternatives, primarily river travel and the ancient overland post road, could not provide. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway was an engineering achievement of the first order, requiring the bridging of major Siberian rivers, the laying of track across permafrost, the tunneling through the rocky terrain around Lake Baikal, and the organization of a workforce of approximately 90,000 men, including convict laborers, working simultaneously on multiple sections across thousands of kilometers of largely uninhabited wilderness. The railway transformed Siberia in ways that exceeded even Witt's ambitious projections. It enabled the migration of approximately 5 million peasants from European Russia to the agricultural lands of Western Siberia in the 2 decades following its completion, dramatically accelerating the settlement and economic development of the region. It also had specific strategic consequences, enabling the rapid movement of Russian troops to the Far East, that contributed to the decision to challenge Japanese expansion in Manchuria, a challenge that produced the catastrophic Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Fact 18. The Romanov women, empresses and grand duchesses. The women of the Romanov dynasty, the empresses, grand duchesses and princesses whose specific lives were shaped by the intersection of the dynasty's imperial power and the specific constraints that the imperial court's ceremonial rigidity and the patriarchal assumptions of 19th century Russia placed on women's autonomy and self-expression, occupy in the history of the Romanovs a position of simultaneous prominence and invisibility. Prominent because the specific human drama of their lives, their marriages into foreign royal houses, their personal relationships with the czars they served or influenced, and in the case of the ruling empresses, their direct exercise of political power is central to the dynasty's story, and invisible because the historical tradition of the period consistently subordinated their specific experiences to those of the men around them. The Empress Maria Feodorovna, born Princess Dagmar of Denmark in 1847, the wife of Alexander III and the mother of Nicholas II, was one of the most capable and most personally formidable women in the history of the late Romanov dynasty. A small woman of extraordinary energy and political intelligence, whose specific influence over her husband and her son was exercised through the specific channels available to women of her position: personal persuasion, social management, and the cultivation of the relationships that shaped the court's political atmosphere. Her specific relationship with her daughter-in-law Alexandra, the German princess who married Nicholas II, and who became in the court's judgment insufficiently Russian, insufficiently warm, and dangerously susceptible to the influence of Rasputin, was one of the defining personal tensions of the dynasty's final years. A collision between two strong-willed women with fundamentally different visions of what the Romanov dynasty required to survive the specific pressures of the early 20th century. Maria Feodorovna survived the revolution and died in Denmark in 1928, never accepting the death of her son Nicholas and his family, maintaining to the end of her life that they had somehow survived. Fact 19. The Russo-Japanese War, a humiliation in the East. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, the conflict between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan for dominance in Manchuria and Korea, initiated by a Japanese surprise attack on the Russian naval squadron at Port Arthur on the night of February 8, 1904, and concluded by the Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905, in a Japanese victory that shocked the European powers and transformed the political situation within Russia by demonstrating the specific incapacity of Nicholas II's government to manage either a modern war or the domestic political consequences of losing one, was the first major war in modern history in which an Asian nation defeated a European great power. And the specific military defeat that most directly produced the revolutionary crisis of 1905. The war's military disasters accumulated with a speed and a comprehensiveness that the Russian government had not anticipated when it allowed the conflict to develop. The siege of Port Arthur, the Russian Pacific naval base on the Manchurian coast, lasted 5 months before the garrison surrendered in January 1905, at a cost of approximately 31,000 Russian dead and the loss of the Russian Pacific Squadron. The Battle of Mukden in February and March 1905, the largest land battle in history to that point, involving approximately 600,000 men on both sides, ended in a comprehensive Russian defeat with approximately 90,000 Russian casualties. The Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, in which the Russian Baltic fleet, which had sailed approximately 29,000 kilometers around the world to reinforce the Pacific theater, was virtually annihilated by the Japanese Navy in a 2-day engagement that sank or captured 34 of the 38 Russian warships, was the most comprehensive naval defeat suffered by any major power in the modern era. The specific political consequences within Russia were immediate. The military disasters discredited the government, energized the revolutionary movement, and produced the crisis of 1905 that forced Nicholas II to make the constitutional concessions he had spent his entire reign trying to avoid. Fact 20. The Romanovs at 20, the empire at its crisis point. 20 facts into the story of the Romanovs, and the dynasty has arrived at the specific historical moment that would define its final chapter. The 19th century that the Romanovs had navigated, through the triumph of the Napoleonic Wars, through the humiliation of the Crimean War, through the reforms of Alexander II and their brutal reversal under Alexander III, through the expansion of the empire eastward and the specific failure of the Russo-Japanese War, had deposited in 1905 a dynasty that faced the specific conjunction of challenges that autocratic systems find most difficult to manage. A military humiliation that had discredited the government, a revolutionary movement energized by that humiliation, an industrial working class growing rapidly in the new cities, whose specific conditions of labor produced the specific political radicalization that the socialist parties were organized to exploit, and a Tsar whose specific personality, gentle, devoted to his family, deeply religious, profoundly committed to the autocratic principle, was precisely wrong for the specific demands of the historical moment he had inherited. Nicholas II was not a stupid man. He was not a cruel man. He was a man whose specific formation, raised in the specifically isolated world of the imperial court, educated in the specific conviction that his authority was divine, and that constitutional reform was a betrayal of his sacred duty, had given him every quality that the position of an absolute monarch in a period of calm required, and almost none of the qualities that the position of a constitutional monarch in a period of revolutionary crisis required. The 80 facts that remain will carry us through the specific catastrophe of the dynasty's final years: Rasputin, the hemophilia, the First World War, the Revolution, and the specific human story of the family that was consumed by the collapse of everything they had been raised to believe was eternal. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 21. Nicholas II, the last Tsar. Nicholas II, born May 18, 1868, Emperor of Russia from November 1, 1894 to March 15, 1917, the last of the Romanov dynasty and the last Tsar in the history of Russia, was a man whose specific personal qualities, his gentleness, his devotion to his family, his religious sincerity, his genuine love of the Russian land and people, made him in many contexts an admirable human being, and in the specific context of governing a vast empire through the most turbulent period in its history, a catastrophically inadequate ruler. A man who held with absolute conviction the specific belief that his autocratic authority was a sacred trust from God that no human institution had the right to limit, whose specific political instinct was to retreat from difficult decisions into the reassuring ritual of family life, and whose specific response to every challenge to his authority was to dig in, to dismiss ministers who urged reform, and to trust that God would not abandon the dynasty that ruled in his name. Nicholas had not expected to become Tsar. His father Alexander III had died at the age of 49 from kidney disease, far earlier than anyone had anticipated, and Nicholas came to the throne at 26, having received the political education of a Romanov Grand Duke, rather than the more intensive preparation a crown prince might have expected. He confided to his cousin Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich that he had no idea how to govern and was terrified of what was expected of him. He was not exaggerating. His first major public occasion as Tsar, the coronation celebrations of May 1896, was marred by the Kodinka tragedy, in which approximately 1,389 people were crushed to death in a crowd surge during the distribution of coronation gifts, an event whose specific horror Nicholas's government attempted to minimize, and that established from the beginning of his reign the specific pattern of denial, minimization, and retreat from the human reality of his subjects' lives that would characterize every subsequent crisis. Nicholas believed in autocracy not because he was power-hungry. He was temperamentally unsuited to the exercise of power and would have preferred the life of a country gentleman, but because he genuinely believed that God had appointed him as the absolute ruler of Russia, and that to surrender any portion of that authority to elected representatives would be to betray a sacred trust. This specific theological conviction, combined with his specific psychological weakness, the inability to sustain a difficult position under personal pressure, the tendency to agree with the last person who had spoken to him, made him simultaneously unwilling to reform the system and unable to govern it effectively as it was. Fact 22. Alexandra, the German Empress. Alexandra Fedorovna, born Princess Alex of Hesse, and by Rhine on June 6, 1872, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, who came to Russia as the bride of Nicholas II in November 1894, and became in the Russian public's perception one of the most unpopular empresses in the history of the dynasty, was a woman whose specific personal qualities were almost perfectly calibrated to make her role in Russia maximally difficult. Deeply introverted in a court that required social ease, chronically anxious in a position that demanded public confidence, stubbornly principled in a political situation that required pragmatic flexibility, and so passionately devoted to her husband and children that the specific suffering of her son Alexei's hemophilia became the organizing principle of her emotional and eventually her political life. Alexandra had genuinely not wanted to marry into the Russian imperial family. She had resisted Nicholas's courtship for years, partly out of reluctance to convert from Lutheranism to Orthodoxy and partly from a specific presentiment, which she expressed in letters that historians have subsequently recovered, that the marriage would end in tragedy. She converted eventually, telling her diary that she felt she was being buried alive, and came to Russia with a German upbringing and English manners that the Russian aristocracy found cold, and with a piety so intense and so private that it seemed, to those who encountered it without sympathy, like arrogance or disdain. The Russian court's specific assessment of Alexandra, that she was cold, proud, German, and insufficiently devoted to Russia, was unfair in its specific charges while accurate in its general sense that she never found the emotional language that would have allowed her to connect with the Russian people whose empress she had become. Her intense religiosity made her specifically susceptible to the mystical spirituality that Rasputin embodied, and her specific desperation about Alexei's condition made her willing to believe in the specific power that Rasputin claimed to possess. The combination of Alexandra's influence over Nicholas, her reliance on Rasputin, and her specific political interventions during the First World War produced a set of decisions that accelerated the dynasty's collapse with a speed that even the most pessimistic observers of the pre-war period had not predicted. Fact 23. The 1905 Revolution, the first warning. The Revolution of 1905, the wave of political strikes, worker uprisings, military mutinies, and peasant revolts that swept through the Russian Empire between January and December 1905, triggered by the humiliations of the Russo-Japanese War and crystallized by the specific event of Bloody Sunday, and that forced Nicholas II to make the constitutional concessions he had spent his entire reign trying to avoid, was the first serious revolutionary crisis of the Romanov dynasty's final chapter. A genuine near-collapse of imperial authority whose specific outcome, the regime's survival through the October Manifesto's promise of a constitution and an elected parliament, was less a genuine stabilization than a temporary reprieve purchased at the cost of the autocratic principle that Nicholas held sacred, a reprieve that Nicholas immediately began to undermine by restricting the powers of the Duma and dismissing ministers who took the constitutional settlement seriously. Bloody Sunday, January 22, 1905, was the event that transformed the specific discontent produced by the Russo-Japanese War's disasters into a mass revolutionary movement. On that morning, a procession of approximately 150,000 workers led by the Orthodox priest Father Georgy Gapon marched toward the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar requesting an 8-hour working day, a minimum wage, and an elected constituent assembly. The petition's tone was that of loyal subjects appealing to a father. We, the workers and inhabitants of Saint Petersburg, our wives, our children, and our aged, helpless parents, come to thee, O Sire, to seek justice and protection. Nicholas was not at the Winter Palace. He was at Tsarskoye Selo, and the troops guarding the palace, without orders from a coherent central authority, opened fire on the crowd. The precise number killed is disputed, between 130 and several hundred, but the specific image of soldiers shooting unarmed workers who were carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar destroyed in a single afternoon the specific myth of the Tsar as the people's protector that had sustained the dynasty's popular legitimacy for centuries. The revolution that followed lasted 11 months and was suppressed only by the combination of the October Manifesto's constitutional promises and the government's increasingly brutal use of military force against strikers and peasant revolts. Fact 24. The October Manifesto, too little, too late. The October Manifesto of October 30, 1905, the document in which Nicholas II, under the specific pressure of the general strike that had paralyzed the Russian economy, and under the specific advice of Sergei Witte, who told the Tsar that the only alternatives to the manifesto were constitutional concessions or military dictatorship, and that military dictatorship required a military leader with sufficient personal authority to implement it, which Nicholas himself did not possess. Announced the creation of an elected legislative body, the State Duma granted civil liberties including freedom of speech, assembly, and association, and promised that no law would take effect without the Duma's approval, effectively transforming Russia from an absolute autocracy into a constitutional monarchy. The specific political compromise represented by the October Manifesto satisfied no one completely and satisfied the most important parties barely at all. The liberal constitutional Democrats, the Cadets, accepted it as a beginning while demanding more extensive reforms. The socialists, social democrats, and socialist revolutionaries denounced it as an insufficient concession designed to divide the revolutionary movement and continued to press for more radical change. The conservative Octobrists accepted it as a sufficient settlement. And Nicholas himself, who had signed the manifesto under specific duress, and who wrote in his diary on the day of its signing that he felt sick with shame at this betrayal of the dynasty, spent the following years working to restrict the Duma's powers, gerrymander the electoral system to reduce the representation of the most politically active classes, and dismiss prime ministers who attempted to implement the manifesto's promises in ways that encroached on what he regarded as his autocratic prerogatives. The specific political dynamic of the years between 1905 and 1914, in which the regime's grudging concessions were consistently followed by attempts to reclaim what had been conceded, producing a cycle of reform and restriction that satisfied neither the reformers nor the conservatives, reflected Nicholas's specific inability to accept the constitutional settlement as genuine rather than as an emergency measure to be reversed when the emergency passed. Fact 25. Stolypin, the reformer Russia needed. Pyotr Stolypin, Prime Minister of Russia, from July 1906 to September 1911, the most capable and the most consequential government official of Nicholas II's reign, whose specific program of agrarian reform combined with the ruthless suppression of the revolutionary movement, attempted to create the specific conditions. A stable, prosperous peasant smallholder class with a material stake in the preservation of the existing order. That he believed were the necessary foundation for a viable constitutional monarchy in Russia was the specific individual whose assassination in September 1911 removed from the Russian political scene the one figure who possessed both the political intelligence to understand what the system required and the personal authority to implement it. Stolypin's agrarian reform, the legislation passed between 1906 and 1911 that allowed peasants to withdraw from the communal land tenure of the Mir and consolidate their allotments into individual hereditary farms, was the most significant rural reform since the emancipation of 1861, and its specific logic was both economic and political. Economically, the creation of individual peasant property was intended to break the cycle of subsistence farming that the communal system perpetuated and to create the incentives for agricultural investment and productivity improvement that individual ownership provides. Politically, Stolypin calculated that a peasantry of individual property owners would be a conservative force, that men with farms of their own would be hostile to the socialist redistribution that the revolutionary movement promised and supportive of the political order that guaranteed their property rights. His specific phrase, "Give the state 20 years of internal and external peace and you will not recognize Russia," expressed a genuine strategic vision whose specific optimism was perhaps excessive but whose underlying logic was sound. Stolypin was shot by a revolutionary with connections to the Okhrana, the secret police, at the Kiev Opera on September 14, 1911, in the presence of Nicholas II. He died 4 days later. Nicholas expressed grief, but no particular urgency, about investigating the specific role of his own secret police in the assassination of his most capable minister. Stolypin's death removed the one figure in the Russian government who had both the vision to understand what the system required and the will to demand it. Fact 26. Rasputin, the peasant who haunted a dynasty. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, born approximately 1869 in the Siberian village of Pokrovskoye, a peasant of limited education and no formal religious training, whose specific combination of hypnotic personal presence, apparent healing abilities, and the mystical religious authority of the Stranik, the wandering holy man of the Russian Orthodox tradition, brought him from Siberian obscurity to the innermost circle of the Romanov family, where his specific influence over the Empress Alexandra derived from his apparent ability to relieve the suffering of the hemophiliac Tsarevich Alexei, made him one of the most politically consequential individuals in the final decade of the dynasty's existence, was simultaneously the most remarkable and the most damaging figure in the specific human drama of the Romanov collapse. A man whose genuine charismatic gifts were deployed in a context that amplified every negative consequence of Alexandra's reliance on him, and that provided the Russian press and political opposition with the specific symbol of dynastic corruption and irrationality that undermined whatever remained of the regime's public credibility. Rasputin's first meeting with the imperial family occurred in November 1905, and his specific ability to relieve Alexei's hemophilic crises, through a mechanism that remains debated, with hypotheses ranging from hypnotic suggestion to the specific effect of his reported instruction to the court physicians to discontinue aspirin, which thins the blood and would have worsened a hemophilic episode, established the specific hold over Alexandra that no political argument No family pressure and no accumulation of evidence about his disreputable personal life could break Alexandra's specific conviction that Rasputin was sent by God to protect her son, and by extension the dynasty, was absolute and impervious to contradiction, and Nicholas, whose specific weakness in the face of Alexandra's passionate certainty, was one of the most consequential dynamics of the reign's final years. Consistently refused to take decisive action against Rasputin despite repeated warnings from his own family and ministers about the political damage that Rasputin's presence was causing. The specific stories about Rasputin's behavior, the drinking, the sexual adventures, the boasts about his influence at court, were widely circulated and widely believed, and they attached themselves to the imperial family in a way that made the dynasty appear simultaneously decadent and ridiculous. Fact 27. The imperial children, 5 lives cut short. The 5 children of Nicholas II and Alexandra: Olga, born November 15, 1895, Tatiana, born June 10, 1897, Maria, born June 26, 1899, Anastasia, born June 18, 1901, and Alexei, born August 12, 1904, were among the most closely observed and most romantically mythologized children in the history of the modern world. 4 girls and a boy who grew up in the specific hothouse atmosphere of the Romanov imperial court, largely isolated from children outside their immediate family, educated by a succession of tutors in languages and history and music, photographed extensively by a family that embraced the new technology of amateur photography with genuine enthusiasm, and who were murdered together with their parents in a basement in Yekaterinburg on July 17, 1918, at ages ranging from 22 to 13, lives so completely consumed by the catastrophe that destroyed their dynasty that the human beings they were have been frequently obscured by the symbolic roles they have played in the mythology of the Romanov tragedy. The 4 Grand Duchesses, known within the family by the collective nickname OTMA from the first letters of their names, were described by those who knew them as lively, warm, and remarkably unpretentious given their circumstances. Girls who were close to each other and to their parents, who performed nursing duties in military hospitals during the First World War with genuine dedication rather than aristocratic condescension, and whose specific characters, Olga's intellectual seriousness, Tatiana's efficient practicality, Maria's warm openness, Anastasia's irrepressible humor, were sufficiently distinct that the people who encountered them remembered them as specific individuals rather than as interchangeable imperial daughters. Alexei, the Tsarevich, the heir, the specific human being around whom so much of the dynasty's final years turned, was a bright, energetic, and mischievous boy whose specific medical condition, hemophilia, caused him such suffering that the awareness of it colored every aspect of his parents' emotional and political life. Fact 28. Hemophilia, the disease that changed history. The hemophilia that afflicted Tsarevich Alexei, the hereditary blood-clotting disorder passed through the female line of Queen Victoria's descendants to multiple European royal families, transmitted to Alexei through his mother Alexandra, and manifesting in the inability of the blood to clot normally so that any internal bleeding from a fall, a bruise, a minor injury could produce episodes of excruciating pain as blood accumulated in the joints and cavities. Episodes that could last for days, and that in the most severe cases threatened to kill the child through uncontrolled internal hemorrhage, was the specific medical fact that shaped the final decade of the Romanov dynasty, with consequences whose full dimensions are still debated by historians. The disease was kept secret from the Russian public, partly from the specific dynastic concern that visible weakness in the heir to the throne would encourage revolutionary movements and foreign powers, and partly from the specific parental instinct of 2 people who loved their son and could not bear for the full extent of his suffering to become a matter of public knowledge. The specific political consequence of this secrecy was that Rasputin's hold over Alexandra, derived from his apparent ability to alleviate Alexei's crises, was invisible to the Russian public, which knew only that a disreputable Siberian peasant had been admitted to the innermost circle of the imperial family for reasons that no one in authority would explain. The specific medical mechanism of hemophilia, passed through female carriers who are themselves unaffected to approximately half their male children, meant that Queen Victoria had inadvertently distributed this specific vulnerability through the royal houses of Europe. Her daughter Alice had transmitted it to Alexandra, and through Alexandra to Alexei. 3 of Victoria's sons and 6 of her grandsons were affected, earning the disease its historical designation as the royal disease. The specific irony that the most powerful dynasty in the world was brought to its crisis in part by the medical vulnerability of the single male, ere it had spent 11 years waiting for, is one of the most remarkable intersections of biology and history in the modern era. Fact 29. The Romanov wealth and empire's treasury. The personal wealth of the Romanov dynasty, the accumulated treasure of 3 centuries of absolute rule over the world's largest empire, consisting of imperial palaces, art collections of incomparable quality, jewelry of extraordinary value, and financial assets deposited in European banks, was at its peak in the early 20th century, the largest concentration of private wealth in the world. A fortune so immense that its specific dimensions have never been fully calculated, and whose specific fate, dispersed, looted, sold, and hidden in the chaos of the revolution, remains one of the most persistent mysteries of the post-imperial period. The Romanov jewels alone, the diamonds, emeralds, rubies, sapphires and pearls accumulated by generations of tsars and empresses, including the specific collection of Fabergé eggs commissioned by Alexander III and Nicholas II as Easter gifts for their empresses, constituted a treasury of extraordinary value and beauty. The imperial Fabergé eggs, 50 were made for the imperial family between 1885 and 1916, each containing a specific miniature surprise inside the elaborately crafted shell of precious metals and gemstones, were among the most exquisite objects produced by any craft tradition in the history of the world, and they survive today in museums and private collections as the most tangible artistic legacy of the Romanov dynasty's specific culture of luxury. Alexandra's personal jewelry collection, including a diamond necklace of 475 stones and pearl accessories of extraordinary quality, was sewn into the bodices and corsets of the imperial daughters during the family's captivity, in the specific hope that the jewels could be used to finance an escape or to establish themselves in exile. The discovery of the jewels, their specific discovery sewn into the clothing of the murdered family, was among the most disturbing pieces of evidence recovered by the White Army investigators who examined the execution site. Fact 30. The Romanovs at 30, the world before the storm. 30 facts into the story of the Romanovs, and the dynasty stands in the specific moment of maximum apparent stability and maximum hidden fragility that so often precedes historical catastrophe. The Russia of 1913, the year of the Romanov tercentenary, when the dynasty celebrated 300 years of rule with elaborate ceremonies in which Nicholas and his family traveled through the empire, receiving the homage of their subjects, was by many measurable standards a country of genuine and rapid development. Industrial production was growing at approximately 8% annually, agricultural output was increasing, the railway network was expanding, and the specific combination of Stolypin's agrarian reforms and the general economic growth of the pre-war period was producing in the Russian countryside the beginnings of the peasant smallholder class that Stolypin had identified as the necessary social foundation for a stable constitutional order. The specific impression of celebration that the tercentenary created, the vast crowds, the religious ceremonies, the military reviews, the genuine popular enthusiasm for the dynasty that was visible in the provincial cities through which the imperial family traveled, was real enough, and it created in Nicholas a specific confidence in the depth of his dynasty's popular support that the events of the following years would catastrophically contradict. Beneath the surface of the celebrations, the specific structural problems that would destroy the dynasty were not diminishing but intensifying. The revolutionary movement, though suppressed, was reorganizing. The Duma was producing a generation of political leaders whose specific experience of governmental obstruction was radicalizing rather than moderating their opposition. The German threat to European stability was growing. And Rasputin continued to occupy his specific position in the imperial household, providing the revolutionary press with its most potent symbol of the regime's corruption. 70 facts remain. They will carry us through the First World War that destroyed the dynasty, the revolution that ended it, the murder that concluded it, and the mystery of what survived. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 31. The Romanov court's social world, balls, ranks, and precedents. The social world of the Romanov imperial court, the elaborate hierarchy of ranks, the seasonal rhythms of balls and receptions, the specific protocols governing who could speak to whom in what order and at what distance, the intricate web of family connections and factional alliances that constituted the lived experience of the approximately 3,000 people who formed the inner world of the court at any given moment, was one of the most formally regulated social environments in the history of the modern world, and one whose specific character expressed with particular clarity the Romanov dynasty's understanding that the visible performance of hierarchy was itself a form of political power. The table of ranks, introduced by Peter the Great in 1722, and maintained with modifications throughout the Romanov period, organized Russian society into 14 parallel hierarchies of military, civil, and court ranks, whose specific gradations determined every dimension of social interaction, from the form of a dress ode to a person to the style of carriage they were permitted to use to the specific position they occupied at court ceremonies. A person's rank determined not merely their social position but their legal status, their access to the Tsar, and their eligibility for specific court appointments, whose proximity to the imperial family conferred both prestige and political influence. The annual winter season in Saint Petersburg, the series of balls, receptions, and entertainments concentrated in the months between Christmas and Lent, was the social centerpiece of the Romanov year and the specific occasion at which the dynasty's wealth and cultural sophistication were displayed to their subject population and to the foreign diplomatic community simultaneously. The most important of the season's events was the Winter Palace Ball, held in the Nicholas Hall, whose white and gold dimensions could accommodate approximately 3,000 guests, at which the imperial family's appearance, Nicholas in military dress uniform, Alexandra in a gown that the court jeweler spent weeks preparing, was the central act of a ceremony designed to communicate the specific magnificence of the dynasty. Behind the spectacle lay the specific human realities of court competition, the intense maneuvering for proximity to the imperial family, the factional rivalries that shaped policy debates, and the specific ennui of intelligent men and women whose existence was organized around the performance of ritual rather than the exercise of meaningful autonomy. Fact 32. The Fabergé eggs, art in service of dynasty. The imperial Easter eggs commissioned from the House of Fabergé by Alexander III and Nicholas II, 50 eggs made between 1885 and 1916, each presented by the Tsar to his Empress on Easter morning, as an expression of the specific Easter gift-giving tradition of the Russian Orthodox Church, transformed into an act of imperial magnificence. Were the most exquisite objects produced by any craft tradition in the history of the Romanov dynasty, and the specific artistic legacy through which the dynasty's culture of luxury is most immediately known to the 21st century world. The specific arrangement was initiated by Alexander III, who commissioned Karl Fabergé to produce a surprise egg for his Empress Maria Feodorovna in 1885. The first egg, a white enamel shell opening to reveal a golden yolk, within which was a golden hen, within which was a miniature diamond crown and a tiny ruby pendant, so delighted the Empress that Alexander commissioned a new egg each year thereafter, with the single stipulation that it must contain a surprise, and that the nature of the surprise must remain unknown to the recipient until the moment of presentation. Nicholas continued the tradition after his father's death, commissioning 2 eggs each year, one for his mother and one for Alexandra, until the First World War interrupted production after 1916. The surviving imperial eggs, 35 of the 50 are accounted for today in museum and private collections, are objects of extraordinary technical and artistic achievement. Shells of gold, silver, and platinum encrusted with diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, and enamel in colors of hallucinatory richness, opening to reveal miniature surprises of corresponding intricacy. The Trans-Siberian Railway egg of 1900 contains a working model of the Trans-Siberian Express, accurate in every detail, with a clockwork mechanism allowing it to be wound with a tiny golden key and driven the length of its track. The Winter Palace egg of 1906 contains miniature watercolor paintings of the palace's most significant rooms. Each egg was the product of months of labor by teams of the most skilled craftsmen in Russia, and each expressed in material form the specific Romanov, understanding that the dynasty's greatness should be visible and tangible in objects whose perfection reflected the perfection of the imperial order they served. Fact 33. Rasputin's influence, the political cost. The specific political damage caused by Rasputin's presence in the innermost circle of the imperial family, the way in which his influence over Alexandra translated into influence over ministerial appointments, over military decisions, and over the specific policies of a government fighting for its survival in the First World War, was not merely the product of his personal disreputability, but of the specific structural vulnerability of a system in which the Empress's private convictions could determine public policy without any institutional check on the process by which those convictions were formed or the decisions they produced. Alexandra's reliance on Rasputin was absolute and impervious to argument, when family members, ministers, and close advisors warned Nicholas that Rasputin's presence was politically catastrophic, that the Russian public's awareness of his role in the household was destroying whatever remained of the dynasty's moral authority. Nicholas would typically agree in the presence of the person making the argument, and then, under Alexandra's passionate insistence, reverse whatever decision he had made or failed to implement it. The specific decisions in which Rasputin's influence was most politically damaging were the ministerial appointments of the period, during which Nicholas was at the front commanding the army personally. The period from September 1915 onward, in which Alexandra, left in Petrograd to manage political affairs, consulted Rasputin on ministerial questions and reported his opinions to Nicholas with an insistence that was often decisive. Ministers were appointed and dismissed at Rasputin's suggestion. Military decisions were filtered through Alexandra's reports of Rasputin's spiritual insights, and the government of the largest state in the world was being influenced by a Siberian peasant whose specific qualifications for the role consisted of his apparent ability to relieve a child's medical symptoms. The specific absurdity of the situation was visible to virtually everyone in the Russian political class, and the specific disgust it produced was not confined to the liberal opposition. It extended to members of the Romanov family itself, who would eventually take matters into their own hands. Fact 34. The First World War, the catastrophe that broke everything. Russia's entry into the First World War in August 1914, responding to Austria-Hungary's declaration of war against Serbia by mobilizing in defense of its Slavic ally, triggering Germany's declaration of war and the activation of the military alliance system that turned a Balkan crisis into a continental catastrophe, placed on the Romanov dynasty the specific set of demands that its political and administrative system was least equipped to meet. The sustained organizational, logistical, and political management of a total war against Germany and Austria-Hungary that required levels of industrial mobilization, administrative coordination, and political flexibility that the autocratic system had never developed, and that the specific character of Nicholas II's governance made it particularly difficult to improvise. The early months of the war produced the specific kind of nationalist enthusiasm that wars in their opening phase typically generate: patriotic demonstrations in the major cities, the renaming of Saint Petersburg to the more Russian-sounding Petrograd, the temporary suspension of the strike movement that had been paralyzing Russian industry before the war's outbreak. The specific military reality was considerably less encouraging. The Russian army's performance in the war's first year combined episodes of genuine effectiveness. The Brusilov offensive of 1916, which captured approximately 400,000 Austro-Hungarian prisoners in the most successful Allied operation of the entire war to that point. With catastrophic defeats that reflected the specific organizational inadequacies of a military system whose officer corps had been damaged by the Russo-Japanese War's losses, and whose industrial base was insufficient to supply the ammunition consumption that the Western Front's experience had demonstrated was essential. By 1915, Russian infantry was being sent into battle without adequate rifle ammunition, without adequate artillery support, and in some cases without rifles. A material failure of the Russian war economy that produced approximately 1.7 million Russian soldiers killed, approximately 5 million wounded, and approximately 2.5 million captured in the first 2 years of the war. Losses on a scale that no political system, without a genuine basis of popular consent, could sustain indefinitely. Fact 35. Nicholas at the front, the fatal decision. Nicholas II's decision of September 1915 to take personal command of the Russian army as supreme commander, replacing his cousin Grand Duke Nicholas, who had been serving as commander since the war's beginning, was widely regarded at the time by virtually everyone in the Russian political establishment as one of the most consequential political errors of his reign, and it proved to be precisely that. A decision whose specific short-term rationale, the desire to identify the dynasty directly with the war effort, to provide moral leadership to the armies, and to prevent any other individual from accumulating the political prestige that military success might generate, produced a set of long-term consequences that accelerated the dynasty's collapse in ways that Nicholas had not anticipated and could not have managed even if he had. The specific short-term military consequence of Nicholas's assumption of command was not catastrophic. The Brusilov offensive of 1916, the greatest Russian military success of the entire war, occurred under Nicholas's nominal supreme command, though the actual operational direction was entirely Brusilov's. The specific political consequence was devastating. By taking personal command, Nicholas placed his own person in the direct line of accountability for every subsequent military failure. Every Russian defeat, every strategic error, every logistical failure of the war effort was now the Tsar's personal failure. And the specific political consequence of his departure from Petrograd, leaving Alexandra in the capital, consulting Rasputin, managing ministerial appointments with the political judgment that her specific character and her specific advisor were least equipped to provide, was the specific domestic governance disaster of 1915 to 1917, in which the rapid rotation of ministers at Rasputin's suggestion produced what the Russian press called ministerial leapfrog, the appointment and dismissal of 4 prime ministers, 5 interior ministers, and 3 foreign ministers in the 18 months between September 1915 and February 1917. Fact 36. The murder of Rasputin, a desperate attempt at salvation. The murder of Grigory Rasputin on the night of December 29 to 30, 1916, carried out by a group of conspirators that included Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia and the husband of the Tsar's niece, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin. And the right-wing politician Vladimir Purishkevich was one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of the Romanov dynasty, and one whose specific dramatic character, the poisoned wine, the shooting, the body dumped through a hole in the ice of the Neva River, has generated a mythology whose specific details have been contested by historians ever since. The conspirators' motivation was the specific belief, widely shared in the Romanov family and the Russian aristocracy by late 1916, that Rasputin's continued influence over Alexandra, and through her over Nicholas, was the primary obstacle to the political reforms that might still save the dynasty, that his removal would allow Nicholas to hear the advice of competent ministers, rather than the mystical insights of a Siberian peasant filtered through his empress's passionate certainty. The specific plan involved inviting Rasputin to Yusupov's Moika palace on the pretext of meeting Yusupov's wife, poisoning him with cyanide-laced wine and cakes, shooting him when the poison appeared to fail, and disposing of the body in the frozen Neva. The specific forensic evidence examined by investigators who recovered the body suggested that Rasputin had been shot multiple times, with the final wound administered at close range, and had been alive when thrown into the river. His lungs contained water. The murder did not save the dynasty. Nicholas exiled the conspirators, Yusupov to his country estate, Dmitry to the Persian front, with punishments so mild that they seemed to confirm the specific perception that the dynasty could not take its own defense seriously. Alexandra's grief was total and immediate. Within 2 months of Rasputin's death, the dynasty itself was gone. Fact 37. The February Revolution, the end comes suddenly. The February Revolution of 1917, the popular uprising that began in Petrograd on February 23, 1917, with bread riots and International Women's Day demonstrations, spread rapidly to include the majority of the city's industrial workers, triggered the mutiny of the garrison troops ordered to suppress the protests, and produced within 5 days the collapse of the autocracy that the Romanov dynasty had maintained for 304 years, was not the result of a planned revolutionary seizure of power, but a spontaneous social explosion, whose specific origins lay in the accumulated pressures of 3 years of catastrophic war, rapidly rising food prices, fuel shortages in the bitter Russian winter, and the specific political crisis of a government that had lost the confidence of virtually every sector of Russian society, including the aristocracy, the military leadership, and the commercial class that had previously been its most reliable social support. Nicholas, at military headquarters in Mogilov, received the initial reports of disorder in Petrograd with characteristic minimization, instructing the military governor to suppress the disturbances with force. The troops ordered to fire on the crowds did so on February 26. The following morning, the Volinsky regiment, whose soldiers had participated in the shootings and whose specific conscience apparently could not sustain the experience, mutinied, shot their own commander, and joined the demonstrators. The mutiny spread through the Petrograd garrison with a speed that left the government without the military force to suppress the uprising. The members of the State Duma, constitutionally prohibited from meeting by an imperial decree and meeting anyway in defiance of it, established a provisional committee. The Petrograd Soviet, the Council of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies that immediately formed in parallel, issued its Order No. 1, which effectively transferred control of the military units from their officers to soldier committees elected from the ranks. By the evening of February 27, the Romanov autocracy had effectively ceased to function. Fact 38. The abdication, the end of an empire. Nicholas II's abdication on March 15, 1917, signed in a railway carriage at the Pskov station, where his train had been stopped by revolutionary railway workers as he attempted to return to Petrograd from military headquarters, was the specific document that ended the 304-year Romanov dynasty and the Russian Empire simultaneously, a document whose specific circumstances, signed by a man whose generals had unanimously recommended abdication, whose Duma had abandoned him, and whose specific isolation from the reality of what was happening in Petrograd had allowed the situation to develop past any point at which he could intervene effectively, expressed the specific pathos of a ruler who had governed badly and was leaving badly, at the end of a process he had failed to control from its beginning. The general's recommendation of abdication, conveyed to Nicholas by telegram from all his front commanders on the morning of March 15, was the specific fact that appears to have convinced Nicholas that the situation was irretrievable. He had been willing to consider abdication before. What he had not expected was the unanimity of the military leadership that had always been the ultimate foundation of autocratic power. If the army would not sustain him, there was nothing to sustain. He initially signed a document abdicating in favor of his son Alexei, with Grand Duke Mikhail serving as regent. Then, after consulting with his physician about whether Alexei's health would survive the separation from his parents that a regency would require, he changed the document to abdicate in favor of his brother Mikhail, who declined the throne the following day when it became clear that no government could guarantee his safety. The Romanov dynasty ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a series of telegrams, consultations, and document revisions in a railway carriage, conducted by a man who wrote in his diary that evening, "All around is treason, cowardice, and deceit." Fact 39, House arrest, the family in captivity. The period between the abdication on March 15, 1917, and the Bolshevik seizure of power on November 7 of the same year. The 8 months during which the provisional government held Nicholas and his family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, in the building that had been their primary residence and that now became their prison, was in some respects the most human and most intimate chapter of the imperial family's story. The period in which the specific trappings of dynasty were stripped away and the family existed as simply themselves, and in which the specific qualities of each member became visible in a way that the elaborate ceremonial of court life had always partially obscured. Nicholas, relieved of the specific burden of political responsibility that he had never felt equipped to carry, adapted to captivity with a stoic equanimity that surprised the guards assigned to watch him, digging in the gardens, chopping wood, reading aloud to the family in the evenings, playing with his children in a domesticity that the demands of his imperial role had always partially prevented. Alexandra, by contrast, found the loss of the specific framework of imperial ceremony more difficult to absorb. Her diary from this period reflects a woman who was processing the collapse of everything she had believed in while simultaneously caring for her sick son and trying to maintain the specific routine that gave structure to the family's days. The children, deprived of the company of their peers, their education disrupted, their future suddenly undefined, adapted with the specific resilience of young people who had always found their primary social world within the family circle and who had each other. When the Bolshevik seizure of power in November 1917 transformed the political situation, the family's captivity became simultaneously more physically constrained and more existentially uncertain. Fact 40, the Romanovs at 40, into the darkness. 40 facts into the story of the Romanovs, and the dynasty has reached the specific historical moment whose approach every fact in this story has been preparing. The captivity that preceded the end, the revolution that ended the world the dynasty had built, and the murder that concluded the story of the specific family at its center. The 40 facts behind us have traced the Romanovs from their emergence from the time of troubles through 3 centuries of imperial grandeur, the palaces and the balls, the serfs and the reformers, the military triumphs and the humiliations, the extraordinary personalities of the great emperors and the specific inadequacy of the last, to the February Revolution that stripped everything away in 5 days and the abdication that ended everything else. What remains is the story of the family in captivity, of the political forces that determined their fate, of the execution that concluded their lives, and of the mystery that has surrounded the end of the dynasty from the moment the bodies were discovered. 60 facts remain. They will carry us through the Bolshevik period, the family's transfer to Siberia, the murder at Yekaterinburg, the fate of the dynasty's surviving members, the Anastasia mystery, and the specific question of what the Romanov story means for those who have inherited the world their dynasty shaped and their revolution transformed. The darkness ahead is absolute. But the story that precedes it, the human story of a family and a civilization, is one of the most extraordinary in the history of the modern world. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 41, the Bolshevik Revolution, a new world ends the old. The Bolshevik seizure of power on the night of November 7 to 8, 1917, the coup in which the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet, acting under Lenin's direction, occupied the key government buildings, communication centers, and strategic points of Petrograd, and arrested the members of the provisional government meeting in the Winter Palace, transformed the specific situation of the former imperial family from that of prisoners of a government that was at least theoretically committed to the rule of law into that of class enemies of a revolutionary regime, whose ideology was explicitly dedicated to the destruction of every institution and every social category that the Romanov dynasty had represented. The Bolshevik seizure of power was not, in November 1917, the inevitable outcome of the February Revolution. The provisional government that had taken power in March had been a genuinely transitional government whose legitimacy rested on its promise to convene a constituent assembly that would determine Russia's future political form. The Constituent Assembly was duly elected in November 1917, and the Bolsheviks received approximately 24% of the vote, the largest single-party share but far short of a majority. When the assembly met in January 1918, the Bolshevik Guards closed it after its first session, on Lenin's orders, when it became clear that the assembly would not vote to transfer power to the Soviet government. The specific political logic of the Bolshevik position was brutally clear. They had power, they intended to keep it, and they had no intention of allowing an elected body to constrain their exercise of it. This specific logic, the logic of revolutionary necessity, that placed the survival of the revolution above any commitment to the democratic institutions, whose creation the revolution had nominally served, determined the fate of every institution of the old regime, including the family of the former Tsar. The Romanovs' specific value to the Bolshevik government oscillated between their utility as potential subjects of a revolutionary show trial, demonstrating the crimes of the old regime, and their danger as potential rallying points for the White Army counter-revolutionary forces that were organizing against the Bolsheviks in the emerging civil war. Fact 42. Tobolsk, exile in Siberia. The transfer of the former imperial family from Tsarskoye Selo to Tobolsk, a remote Siberian town approximately 2,700 kilometers east of Petrograd, organized by the provisional government in August 1917 as a security measure in response to the growing instability of the political situation, was the specific event that carried the Romanovs from the relative comfort of their palace prison into the specific conditions of provincial Siberian exile, whose combination of physical remoteness, uncertain supply, and the psychological weight of genuine uncertainty about the future constituted the most difficult period of their captivity before the final months in Yekaterinburg. The choice of Tobolsk reflected the provisional government's specific calculation that a location so remote, reachable only by river steamer in summer and by sledge across the frozen rivers in winter, would be secure against any attempted rescue or counter-revolutionary action, while remaining accessible enough for the family to be maintained in reasonable physical conditions. The governor's house in Tobolsk, where the family was installed, was larger and more comfortable than they had feared. Nicholas described it in his diary as adequate, a word whose specific Romanov restraint conveys both the relative adequacy of the physical conditions and the specific psychological adjustment that the family was making to a life defined by limitation and uncertainty. The family's daily routine in Tobolsk maintained the discipline and the structure that Nicholas and Alexandra had always imposed on family life. Lessons for the children, religious observance, outdoor exercise when permitted, the reading aloud in the evenings that had been a constant feature of their life together. Nicholas read to the family the complete works of War and Peace during the Tobolsk captivity, a choice whose specific resonance, Tolstoy's great novel about Russia's greatest 19th-century crisis, read aloud by the last Romanov Tsar as his dynasty's own crisis consumed everything around it, is almost too perfect to be credible. Fact 43. The Civil War, Russia tears itself apart. The Russian Civil War that erupted in the months following the Bolshevik seizure of power, the conflict between the Bolshevik Red Army and the various anti-Bolshevik White Army forces that lasted from 1917 to 1922, killed approximately 7 to 12 million people through fighting, famine, and disease, and determined the specific political character of the Soviet state that would govern Russia for the next 70 years. Was the specific context within which the decision about the fate of the Romanov family was made. A brutal, chaotic conflict in which the Bolsheviks' survival as a governing force was genuinely uncertain for much of 1918, and in which the question of what to do with the former Tsar became entangled with the specific military and political emergencies of a regime fighting for its existence on multiple fronts simultaneously. The White Army forces, the loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, moderate socialists, and foreign interventionists, whose specific military operations threatened Bolshevik control of large portions of Russia throughout 1918, included among their political objectives the restoration of some form of legitimate Russian government, for which the existence of the former Tsar and his family provided the most obvious potential focus. The specific military situation in the Ural region where the Romanovs were being held, Yekaterinburg, to which they had been transferred in April 1918, was threatened by the advance of the White Army and the Czech Legion, whose seizure of the Trans-Siberian Railway had created a military front moving progressively closer to the city, provided the specific immediate context for the decision that was made in Moscow in July 1918. The Civil War produced in its own right atrocities comparable in their specific savagery to anything in the history of modern conflict, with both red and white forces conducting mass executions, pogroms against Jewish populations, and terror operations against civilian populations suspected of supporting the opposite side. The specific violence of the Russian Civil War established the institutional culture of arbitrary killing and the contempt for legal constraint that would characterize Soviet governance for the following decades. Fact 44. Transfer to Yekaterinburg, the final journey. The transfer of the Romanov family from Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg in April and May 1918, ordered by the Ural Regional Soviet and approved by Moscow, carried out in 2 stages with Nicholas, Alexandra and Maria traveling first and the other children following when Alexei had recovered sufficiently from a hemophilic crisis to travel, was the specific journey that carried the family to the building in which their lives would end. The Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, a 2-story merchant's house that the Bolsheviks had commandeered and surrounded with a high wooden fence that blocked the window's view of the street, was the specific location that the family's guards called the House of Special Purpose, a designation whose specific bureaucratic neutrality barely concealed its specific meaning. The conditions in Yekaterinburg were considerably more restrictive than those in Tobolsk. The guards were rougher, the physical space was more confined, and the specific atmosphere of hostility was more pronounced and less disguised than at the previous captivity. Nicholas's diary from the Yekaterinburg period records the family's daily routine with a specific matter-of-factness, whose contrast with the specific circumstances is almost unbearable to read. The walks permitted in the small enclosed garden, the meals, the religious readings, the card games in the evenings, the specific small events of a domestic life being maintained in a building that its occupants must have understood on some level was not a way station but a terminus. Alexandra's last diary entry, made on July 16, 1918, the evening before the executions, describes the day's weather and records that they went to bed at 11:30. She died in the basement of the Ipatiev house in the early hours of the following morning. Fact 45. The night of July 17, the murder at Yekaterinburg. The murder of Nicholas II, Alexandra. Their 5 children and 4 members of their household, their physician Dr. Eugene Botkin, the maid Anna Demidova, the cook Ivan Karatonov, and the footman Alexei Trupp, in the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg in the early hours of July 17, 1918, was the specific event that concluded the story of the last Romanov family and the specific crime whose circumstances, whose authorization, and whose exact sequence of events have been the subject of historical investigation and political controversy ever since. The decision to kill the family was made at the highest levels of the Bolshevik state. The specific authorization chain connecting Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the Ipatiev house who organized the execution, to the Ural Regional Soviet, to Moscow and Lenin, has been established by the documentary evidence recovered from Soviet archives after 1991, though the precise form of Moscow's authorization. Whether Lenin personally ordered the executions, or whether the Ural Soviet acted on a general authorization, remains a matter of scholarly debate. The family was woken at approximately midnight and told to dress quickly. They were brought to the basement room and told to wait while the transport that would move them to safety was prepared. Yurovsky then read a brief statement of execution, and the shooting began. The execution was carried out by a group of approximately 11 men in a room approximately 5 meters by 6 meters. A space so small and so confined that the smoke from the guns, the chaos of the firing, and the specific horror of the moment produced an episode of murderous inefficiency that lasted far longer than any of the participants had anticipated. Several of the daughters, whose corsets were sewn with the family's jewels, deflected the first bullets. They were killed by bayonet thrusts and additional shots at close range. The total duration of the killing was approximately 20 minutes. Fact 46. The burial, a secret kept for decades. The disposal of the Romanov family's bodies, carried out under Yurovsky's direction in the hours following the execution, through a process of concealment that reflected both the Bolshevik regime's awareness of the political sensitivity of what it had done and the specific logistical difficulties of burying 11 bodies in the remote Ural countryside under conditions of military urgency, was a secret that the Soviet state maintained for over 70 years, and whose specific details were not publicly acknowledged until after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Yurovsky's plan was to transport the bodies to an abandoned mine shaft at the Four Brothers site, approximately 20 kilometers from Yekaterinburg, and dispose of them there. The execution night's chaos extended into the disposal. The truck carrying the bodies became mired in the muddy forest track. The mine shaft proved too shallow for effective concealment, and Yurovsky eventually ordered the bodies buried in two separate locations, the majority in a pit beneath the forest track at Porosenkov Log. Two of them, identified through subsequent forensic analysis as Alexei and one of his sisters, buried separately approximately 70 meters away. The bodies in both locations were treated with sulfuric acid and burned before burial to make identification more difficult. The White Army investigators who reached Yekaterinburg shortly after the execution, and who conducted the first serious investigation of the crime, found evidence of the execution at the Yekaterinburg house and of body disposal in the forest, but did not locate the burial sites. The primary burial site was discovered by the amateur historian Alexander Avdenin in 1979, but kept secret during the Soviet period. It was officially investigated following Soviet acknowledgement in 1991, and the remains were identified through DNA analysis in 1994. Fact 47: the surviving Romanovs, the family that escaped. The murder at Yekaterinburg killed the immediate nuclear family of Nicholas II, but left alive a substantial number of other Romanov relatives. The Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses, the princes and princesses of the imperial family, whose specific fates in the revolution's aftermath ranged from execution to emigration to the specific experience of building new lives in the diaspora communities of Paris, London, New York, and other cities that became the centers of Russian immigrant culture in the 1920s and beyond. Several other members of the Romanov family were killed by the Bolsheviks in the same general period as the Yekaterinburg murders. Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich, Nicholas's brother and the man to whom he had attempted to abdicate, was killed near Perm on the night of June 12 to 13, 1918, the first member of the Romanov family to be executed by the Bolsheviks. 6 other Romanov Grand Dukes were shot in the Peter and Paul fortress in Petrograd in January 1919. Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich and 3 other Romanovs were pushed into a mine shaft at Alapyevsk on the night of July 17 to 18, 1918, the night after the Yekaterinburg killings, and died from the fall or from the grenades thrown in after them. The surviving Romanovs who managed to leave Russia, including the Empress Maria Feodorovna, Nicholas's mother, who was evacuated from Crimea by a British warship in April 1919 at the insistence of her nephew King George V, formed the nucleus of the Russian immigrant community that maintained throughout the Soviet period the specific cultural and political identity of the old Russia, preserving the Orthodox Church tradition, the Russian language, and the social forms of the imperial world in the drawing rooms and cultural organizations of the European diaspora. Fact 48: Maria Feodorovna, the mother who refused to believe. The Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, the Danish-born mother of Nicholas II, who survived the revolution and lived in exile in Denmark until her death in 1928, occupies in the human story of the Romanov tragedy a position of particular poignancy. The mother who was told that her son and his family had been killed, but who refused, for the remainder of her life, to accept the specific finality of their deaths, maintaining in the face of all evidence and all probability the conviction, or perhaps the deliberate performance of conviction, that Nicholas and at least some of the children had somehow survived. Maria Feodorovna's refusal to accept the family's deaths has been interpreted by historians in multiple ways, as genuine denial driven by the psychological impossibility of accepting the loss of a son, his wife, and 5 grandchildren simultaneously, as a deliberate strategic position designed to preserve the possibility of Romanov dynastic claims in case the Soviet regime collapsed, and as the specific expression of a mother's love that chose hope over evidence because the alternative was unbearable. She refused to attend memorial services for the family, refused to acknowledge their deaths in her public statements, and consistently expressed to those around her the belief that they were alive somewhere, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The specific conversations she had with her surviving younger son Grand Duke Michael's widow and other family members suggest that she was aware, on some level, of the probability of the deaths, but that the specific act of public acknowledgement was something she was constitutionally unable to make. She died in Hvidovre, Denmark, on October 13, 1928, having outlived her son by 10 years. Her remains were repatriated to Saint Petersburg in 2006 and buried beside her husband Alexander III in the Peter and Paul Cathedral. Fact 49: the Yekaterinburg House, a building and its fate. The Yekaterinburg House in Yekaterinburg, the building in whose basement the Romanov family was murdered on the night of July 16 to 17, 1918, which stood on the corner of Voznesensky Prospect and Voznesensky Lane in the center of the city that had been renamed Sverdlovsk in honor of the Bolshevik leader Yakov Sverdlov, survived as a physical structure for 60 years after the executions. Serving in various civilian capacities under the Soviet state, while maintaining in the city's collective memory the specific association with the crime that had occurred within it. The building was demolished in September 1977 on the orders of Boris Yeltsin, then the Communist Party secretary of the Sverdlovsk region. Acting on instructions from Moscow that reflected the specific anxiety of the Brezhnev-era Soviet leadership about the building's potential as a destination for pilgrimage or political demonstration, an anxiety that the growing number of visitors making their way to the site to leave flowers or crosses had made specific and pressing rather than merely theoretical. The specific irony that it was Boris Yeltsin, who would go on to become the first president of the Russian Federation and to oversee the official acknowledgement of the Romanov murders and the burial of the family's remains, who ordered the building's demolition, was not lost on subsequent commentators. On the site of the demolished Ipatiev house stands today the Church on the Blood, the Cathedral of All Saints resplendent in the Russian land, completed in 2003, whose specific architectural form commemorates the site of the murders, and whose lower level contains a chapel at the location of the basement room in which the family died. It is one of the most visited religious sites in Russia, receiving approximately 1 million visitors annually, and on the night of July 16 to 17 each year, the anniversary of the executions, a procession of tens of thousands of people walks through Yekaterinburg to the church in a ceremony of commemoration whose specific scale speaks to the specific place the Romanov story occupies in the contemporary Russian national consciousness. Fact 50: the Romanovs at 50, halfway through the story. 50 facts into the story of the Romanovs, halfway through, and the dynasty's story has completed its arc from emergence to extinction. From the election of the 16-year-old Mikhail in a Moscow convent in 1613, to the murder of Nicholas and his family in a Yekaterinburg basement in 1918, 305 years of a dynasty that built the largest empire in the history of the world, and was consumed by a revolution whose specific causes and specific character were shaped at every stage by the dynasty's specific failures to adapt its governance to the world that was changing around it. The 50 facts behind us have traced the dynasty's history through its great figures, Peter and Catherine, Alexander and Nicholas, and through the specific human story of its last family, Nicholas and Alexandra, the 5 children, Rasputin and the hemophilia, the palaces and the captivity, the murder and its concealment. The 50 facts that remain will carry us through the mythology that has grown around the dynasty's end, the Anastasia legend, the DNA identification, the canonization of the last family as saints of the Russian Orthodox Church, and through the broader story of the Romanov legacy in the world that the revolution made, the immigrant communities, the cultural inheritance, the specific place the Romanov story occupies in Russian national consciousness a century after the dynasty's end. The story of the Romanovs is not only a story about power and its loss. It is a story about the specific human beings who inhabited that power, who were formed by it, limited by it, and ultimately destroyed by it, and about the world they built and the world that was built on their ruins. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 51: Anastasia, the legend that would not die. The legend of Anastasia, the specific myth that the youngest Romanov Grand Duchess had somehow survived the execution at Yekaterinburg, either by being spared at the last moment or by recovering from wounds that the chaos of the killing had left others believing were fatal, and had escaped to live somewhere in the world under concealed identity, was the most persistent and the most culturally potent of all the myths generated by the Romanov catastrophe. A legend whose specific appeal lay in the intersection of the execution's genuine uncertainty in the years before the burial site was located, the human desire to believe that at least one of the 5 children had survived, and the specific romantic drama of a royal princess hiding her identity in the rubble of a destroyed civilization. The legend took its most famous form in the person of Anna Anderson, a woman who appeared in a Berlin canal in 1920 in unclear circumstances, who was identified by supporters as the surviving Anastasia, who spent the next 60 years maintaining that claim against the skepticism of Romanov family members and the active disbelief of the surviving Russian aristocracy, who pursued legal recognition of her identity through the German courts in proceedings that lasted from 1938 to 1970 without producing a definitive legal verdict, and who died in Charlottesville, Virginia in 1984, still claiming to be the Tsar's daughter. Anna Anderson was a compelling figure, intelligent, imperious, possessed of specific knowledge about the imperial family that impressed those inclined to believe her, and that skeptics attributed to extensive research rather than genuine recollection. Several Romanov relatives who met her came away believing or half-believing her claim. Others, including the surviving family members who had actually known Anastasia, were uniformly skeptical. The specific question of Anna Anderson's identity was resolved definitively in 1994 by DNA analysis of tissue samples preserved from a medical procedure she had undergone in 1979, which showed conclusively that she was not related to the Romanovs and was almost certainly Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who had disappeared in 1920. The legend she embodied, the surviving princess, the lost heir, the identity concealed and eventually claimed, survived her exposure as a fraud and continues to generate cultural productions, from the 1997 animated film to the subsequent Broadway musical, that maintain in popular culture an image of the Romanovs whose specific relationship to the historical reality is tangential at best. Fact 52, the DNA identification, science closes the case. The scientific identification of the Romanov remains, the process by which DNA analysis conducted in the 1990s established with near certainty the identities of the bodies recovered from the burial site at Portsenkov Log and later from the second burial site discovered nearby, was one of the most consequential applications of forensic genetics to a historical case in the history of the discipline and the specific scientific achievement that finally closed. At least in evidentiary terms, the question of what had happened to the Romanov family on the night of July 17, 1918, the primary burial site at Portsenkov Log, was excavated by Russian authorities in 1991, following the Soviet Union's acknowledgement of the location, and the skeletal remains of 9 individuals were recovered. The identification was carried out through mitochondrial DNA analysis, comparing the DNA extracted from the skeletal remains to the DNA of living relatives of the Romanov family through the maternal line. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose grandmother Princess Victoria of Hesse was Alexandra's older sister, provided the reference sample for the identification of Alexandra and the children. The identification of Nicholas required the use of a reference sample from a maternal line relative of the Tsar, provided by His Royal Highness Prince Michael of Kent, and subsequently confirmed by the exhumation of Alexander II's body in 1994, whose DNA matched Nicholas's remains. The 9 bodies identified were Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, and 4 members of the household. 2 bodies were missing, identified by their absence as Alexei and one of his sisters, almost certainly Maria. The second burial site, approximately 70 meters from the first, was discovered in 2007 and excavated, yielding the fragmentary burned remains of a young male and a young female. DNA analysis confirmed these as Alexei and Maria, completing the family's account. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had canonized the last imperial family as passion bearers in 2000, has not formally accepted the identification of the Yekaterinburg remains, maintaining that further study is required, a position that reflects the specific theological and political complexities of acknowledging what science has established. Fact 53, the canonization, saints of the new martyrs. Canonization of Nicholas II, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei as saints of the Russian Orthodox Church, proclaimed by the Council of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church on August 20, 2000, in the category of passion bearers, a designation applied to those who accepted their deaths with Christian humility and forgiveness rather than in active defense of the faith, was one of the most significant and most contested acts of the post-Soviet Russian Orthodox Church. Reflecting simultaneously the Church's engagement with the specific historical tragedy of the Romanov murders, its complex relationship with the Soviet state that had persecuted it, and the specific political resonance of the Romanov family's rehabilitation in the context of post-Soviet Russian national identity. The passion bearer designation was specifically chosen rather than the category of martyr, which would have required a determination that the family was killed specifically for their faith rather than for political reasons, reflecting the Church's careful assessment that the historical evidence, while clearly establishing murder for political reasons, did not unambiguously establish death for religious faith in the specific theological sense required for martyrdom. The canonization was not without controversy within the Russian Orthodox community. Critics argued that Nicholas's record as a ruler, his authorization of the use of force against civilian protesters, his governance failures that contributed to the revolution, his specific responsibility for policies that caused immense suffering to the Russian people, made him an inappropriate candidate for sainthood regardless of the manner of his death. Supporters argued that the passion bearer category did not require a saintly life, but only a Christian death, and that the specific dignity with which the family had accepted their captivity and their deaths met that requirement. The canonization has been accepted by the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia and its affiliated churches, while the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, which had canonized the family as martyrs in 1981, has reconciled its position with the Moscow Patriarchates in the context of the broader reunification of the two church bodies in 2007. Fact 54. The Russian emigration, a civilization in exile. The Russian immigrant community that formed in the years immediately following the Bolshevik Revolution, the approximately 1 to 2 million Russians who left their country in the years between 1917 and 1922, settling primarily in Paris, Berlin, Prague, Belgrade, and Constantinople, and subsequently in New York, Shanghai, Harbin, and other cities across the world, was one of the most culturally concentrated diaspora communities in the history of the modern world. A community that included an extraordinary proportion of Russia's intellectual, artistic, and professional elite, and that produced in its decades of exile a body of cultural achievement, in literature, in music, in philosophy, in the visual arts, whose specific quality reflected both the exceptional human capital that the revolution had expelled and the specific creative energy that the experience of loss and displacement generates in those with the talent to transform it into art. Paris became the center of the Russian immigré world in the 1920s, a city in which the specific culture of imperial Russia was preserved and continued in the drawing rooms of the 16th arrondissement, in the Russian restaurants and cabarets of Montparnasse, in the Russian Orthodox churches, whose services were conducted in the Church Slavonic, whose specific liturgical beauty was both a religious practice and a cultural act of preservation. The writers who formed the core of the immigré literary tradition, Ivan Bunin, the first Russian winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, Vladimir Nabokov, who would eventually make the transition to English and produce in Lolita and Pale Fireworks that belonged to the highest level of 20th century fiction, Marina Tsvetiva, whose poetry from the emigration represents the most intense lyrical response to the experience of exile in the Russian tradition, created from the specific materials of loss and nostalgia, a literature whose quality demonstrated that the civilization the revolution had destroyed was capable of generating greatness even in the specific conditions of displacement and impoverishment. Fact 55. The Romanov pretenders claiming an empty throne. The question of Romanov dynastic succession, who, among the surviving relatives of the last imperial family, held the legitimate claim to the Russian imperial throne that the revolution had abolished, but that the immigré community and the Russian monarchist movement maintained as a living political aspiration, was one of the most persistently contentious issues in the internal politics of the Russian diaspora. A dispute that consumed enormous emotional and organizational energy in the immigré community for decades, and that reflected the specific difficulty of applying dynastic rules of succession to a situation for which those rules had never been designed. The primary line of succession, following the deaths of Nicholas II and his children, passed to the surviving Romanov Grand Dukes in order of proximity to the main line. Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich, a first cousin of Nicholas II who had survived the revolution and emigrated to Germany, proclaimed himself curator of the Russian imperial throne in 1922 and emperor of all Russia in 1924, a proclamation that was contested by other members of the Romanov family on the grounds that Kirill had committed specific acts during the revolution, including marching to the State Duma building with his Naval Guards unit in a gesture that was widely interpreted as support for the revolutionary government that disqualified him from dynastic claims under the laws of the empire. The specific dispute between the Kirillovichi branch of the family, Kirill's descendants, who have maintained the dynastic claim through his son Vladimir and his granddaughter Maria, and the other surviving Romanov lines has never been definitively resolved, partly because the Russian throne has not been restored and the question of restoration has remained theoretical, and partly because the specific dynastic rules whose application would determine the outcome are themselves contested. The Russian monarchist movement, which persists in attenuated form in post-Soviet Russia, has never achieved the political significance that would make the resolution of the succession question practically necessary. Fact 56. The Romanov legacy in Russian culture, memory and myth. The specific place of the Romanov dynasty in Russian national culture, the way in which the last imperial family has been remembered, romanticized, mourned, and politically instrumentalized in Russia from the revolution to the present, is one of the most complex dimensions of the dynasty's post-mortem existence. A cultural phenomenon that has passed through multiple phases of official suppression, private preservation, cautious rehabilitation, and eventual public canonization, and that reflects in its specific trajectory the broader evolution of Russian national identity from from Soviet internationalism through post-Soviet uncertainty to the specific nationalist conservatism of the contemporary Russian political culture. During the Soviet period, the official memory of the Romanovs was almost entirely negative. The dynasty was represented as the epitome of class oppression, Tsarist autocracy as the antithesis of everything the revolution had achieved, and the last imperial family as guilty parties in the specific crime of their own class, whose execution was a revolutionary necessity. The specific cultural production of the Soviet period that engaged with the Romanov theme, films, novels, theatrical works, consistently framed the dynasty in the terms of Marxist historical analysis, emphasizing the exploitation and the reactionary character of the regime rather than the human dimensions of the family. The rehabilitation of the Romanov memory in post-Soviet Russia has been rapid and in some respects remarkably complete. Nicholas II, who received consistently negative evaluations from Soviet historians, has been rehabilitated in public opinion surveys to a position of considerable sympathy, aided by the specific combination of his canonization by the Orthodox Church, the publication of previously suppressed materials about the family's personal life and their treatment in captivity, and the specific political utility of the Romanov story as a narrative of Russian civilizational greatness and tragic loss that the current political culture has found useful. Fact 57. The Romanov Palaces Today, Heritage and Tourism. The former Romanov palaces, the Winter Palace and the Hermitage Museum in Saint Petersburg, the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the Peterhof complex on the Gulf of Finland, the Pavlovsk Palace, and the dozens of other imperial residences that have survived the revolution, the Civil War, and the specific destruction of the Second World War, are today among the most visited cultural monuments in Russia and some of the most significant architectural and artistic heritage sites in the world, drawing millions of visitors annually and constituting the primary physical legacy through which the Romanov dynasty's specific culture of grandeur remains accessible to the contemporary world. The Hermitage Museum, the institution that grew from Catherine the Great's personal art collection, acquired initially for her private apartments in the Winter Palace and expanded by successive rulers until it became one of the greatest art collections in the world, contains approximately 3 million objects spanning the entire history of world culture, displayed in the 6 buildings that constitute the museum complex on the south bank of the Neva River. The specific experience of walking through the Hermitage, through the Jordan staircase whose gilded Baroque magnificence still communicates the specific quality of Romanov imperial ambition, through the galleries whose walls are hung with Rembrandts and Rubenses and Matisses, through the Malachite Hall and the Armorial Hall, and the succession of palatial spaces designed to communicate a specific understanding of Russian civilizational achievement, is one of the most remarkable museum experiences in the world, and one whose specific character is inseparable from the dynasty that created it. The Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, devastated by German occupation during the Second World War, the Amber Room was looted and removed, the palace interior largely destroyed, has been painstakingly restored over the past 7 decades and receives approximately 4 million visitors annually, making it one of the most visited historical sites in Russia. Fact 58. The Last Tsar's Diary, a window into a closed world. The Diaries of Nicholas II, the daily record that the last Tsar maintained throughout his adult life, from his teenage years through the final days of captivity in Yekaterinburg, covering approximately half a century of personal observation, whose specific character is simultaneously invaluable as a historical document and frustrating as a psychological portrait, are the most extensive single primary source for the private life of the Romanov dynasty's final generation, and one of the most revealing documents in the history of royal record keeping, precisely because of the specific gap between the scale of the events they record and the apparently inadequate emotional register in which they are described. Nicholas wrote in his diary every day with remarkable consistency, recording the weather, the meals, the exercise, the reading, the family activities with a specificity of domestic detail that reflects both a genuine temperamental preference for the private over the public sphere and a specific psychological pattern of emotional management through concentration on the observable and the controllable. The entries for days of enormous historical significance are often among the most tonally flat in the entire record. The diary entry for January 22, 1905, Bloody Sunday, the day on which soldiers shot unarmed workers outside the Winter Palace, notes that Nicholas spent the day in Tsarskoye Selo and records his distress at the events in Petrograd in terms that have struck subsequent historians as inadequate to their subject. The diary entry for March 15, 1917, the day of the abdication, records the signing of the document and notes that Nicholas went to bed at 3:30 in the morning, having read much about Julius Caesar. The specific combination of historical enormity and apparent emotional underreaction that characterizes these entries has led some historians to conclude that Nicholas was temperamentally incapable of processing the full significance of the events he was living through, while others have suggested that the diary's flat surface conceals a depth of feeling that Nicholas's specific emotional formation made it impossible to express in writing. Fact 59. The Romanovs and the British royal family, cousins who did not help. The specific relationship between the Romanov dynasty and the British royal family, the connection through Queen Victoria that made Nicholas II and King George V first cousins, whose physical resemblance was remarkable enough that they were regularly mistaken for each other in photographs, and whose personal warmth was genuine enough to generate an extensive correspondence that historians have subsequently published, became in the specific context of the February Revolution one of the most morally complex episodes in the history of the British monarchy, the story of a royal family's failure to use its specific political influence to save relatives from a fate that, had it been exercised, might have been averted. The provisional government that took power in March 1917 offered Nicholas and his family asylum in Britain, an offer that the British government under Prime Minister Lloyd George initially accepted. George V subsequently withdrew the offer, citing concerns about the political impact of harboring the deposed Tsar in Britain during wartime at a moment of significant domestic political tension. The specific mechanics of the withdrawal, the communications between the King's private secretary and the Foreign Office, the specific language in which the concerns about British public opinion were expressed, the decision not to press the Russian provisional government more strongly on alternative arrangements, have been the subject of historical investigation for decades. The conclusion that most historians have reached is that George V was more directly involved in the decision to withdraw the asylum offer than official accounts initially suggested, and that the specific concern about the political impact on the British monarchy's own legitimacy, at a period when monarchies across Europe were under pressure, weighed more heavily in the decision than the family relationship that might have been expected to override it. The family who might have saved the Romanovs chose not to. The specific moral weight of that choice has not diminished with the passage of time. Fact 60. The Romanovs at 60, 40 facts from the end. 60 facts into the story of the Romanovs, 40 facts from the end, and the full dimensions of the dynasty's story are visible in their historical and human complexity. The specific narrative arc of the Romanovs encompasses one of the most remarkable trajectories in the history of any ruling family. From the 16-year-old elected in a convent during national emergency to the last Tsar murdered in a basement with his 5 children. From the Baltic swamp on which Peter the Great built a new capital to announce Russia's arrival as a European power to the House of Special Purpose, in which that power's last representative spent his final weeks recording the weather and reading Julius Caesar. The Anastasia legend, the DNA identification, the canonization, the immigrant community, the pretenders, the palaces, all of these are the dynasty's afterlife. The specific forms in which a story that ended in a Yekaterinburg basement in 1918 has continued to inhabit the imagination of the world that survived it. 40 facts remain. They will carry us through the deeper human dimensions of the Romanov story, the specific lives of the great figures who shaped the dynasty, the cultural world of Imperial Russia, the specific objects and places that still carry the dynasty's imprint, and through the question that the entire story ultimately poses. What does the Romanov dynasty mean, a century after its end, for a Russia that is still negotiating its relationship to the imperial past that preceded it and the Soviet catastrophe that followed? The palaces are still standing. The church where the family is buried receives its pilgrims every day. The story is still being written. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 61. The Romanov women who ruled, a dynasty of empresses. The specific history of female rule in the Romanov dynasty, the extraordinary period between 1725 and 1796, in which Russia was governed for all but 5 years by women, producing in Catherine I, Anna, Elizabeth, and Catherine II, a succession of female rulers whose combined reign covered 7 decades of imperial history, and whose specific political achievements included the stabilization of the post-Petran state, the continuation of Russia's territorial expansion, and in the case of Catherine the Great, the most sophisticated exercise of enlightened absolutism in 18th century Europe, was a phenomenon unique in the history of major European powers, and one whose specific character reflected both the specific succession crises that Peter the Great's reforms had created and the specific quality of the women who stepped into the political vacuum those crises generated. Peter the Great's decision to abolish the traditional law of succession and declare that the reigning monarch could appoint any successor meant that after his own death in 1725, without having named an heir, the question of who would govern Russia became a matter of court faction and military force rather than dynastic legality, creating the conditions in which strong-willed women supported by the imperial guard could seize power and hold it. Catherine I, the illiterate Lithuanian peasant woman whom Peter had married after years as his mistress, elevating her to the rank of empress through sheer force of personal attachment, reigned for 2 years after Peter's death, guided by the council of advisors that Peter's legacy had assembled and demonstrating in the process that the specific informal authority she had accumulated during Peter's reign translated into at least functional political leadership in his absence. Elizabeth, Peter's daughter by Catherine I, who seized power from the infant Ivan VI in a coup supported by the Preobrazhensky Regiment Guards in 1741, reigned for 20 years, presiding over a court of considerable cultural sophistication, commissioning the Baroque palaces that still define the architectural character of Saint Petersburg and Tsarskoye Selo, and conducting the 7 Years' War against Frederick the Great with sufficient effectiveness that at the moment of her death in January 1762, Russian forces were occupying Berlin and Frederick was contemplating suicide. It was Catherine the Great who brought this period of female rule to its most consequential expression, 34 years of governance that expanded Russian territory, reformed Russian law, and established Russia as a genuine great power in the European concert. Achievements whose specific quality remains contested by historians, who must weigh the genuine intellectual ambition and administrative talent against the brutal suppression of the Pugachev rebellion and the continued exploitation of the serf system on which the entire edifice of imperial grandeur rested. The specific fact that this dynasty, which associated its authority with divine masculine appointment, produced its greatest rulers from among women who had no formal claim to the throne through the male line of succession, is one of the most revealing paradoxes in the entire history of the Romanov family. Fact 62. Imperial Russian Ballet, Art as Imperial Statement. The Imperial Russian Ballet, the institution founded by the Romanov dynasty as a state enterprise, whose function was simultaneously artistic, social and political, housed in the Mariinsky Theatre in Saint Petersburg and the Bolshoi Theatre in Moscow. Sustained by imperial patronage that guaranteed the resources and the professional stability that allowed the development of a ballet tradition whose specific quality and whose specific influence on the subsequent history of the art form have no parallel in any other national cultural tradition, was the most consequential single cultural achievement of the Romanov dynasty's patronage of the arts, and the specific institution through which the dynasty's understanding of culture as an expression of imperial power was most systematically and most successfully embodied. The Imperial Ballet's history as a great institution begins effectively with the appointment of the French choreographer Marius Petipa as principal choreographer and ballet master in 1869, a position he held for the next 34 years and from which he produced, in collaboration with the composers Tchaikovsky and Glazunov, the canonical works of the classical ballet repertoire. Swan Lake, The Sleeping Beauty, The Nutcracker, La Bayadere, Don Quixote, Raymonde, the specific works that defined what ballet was and what it could be, and that remain the foundation of classical ballet companies' repertoire worldwide a century and a half after their creation. The specific circumstances of this artistic flowering reflected the Romanov dynasty's direct patronage. Petipa worked directly for the Imperial Theatre's administration. The productions were funded by the imperial budget, and the specific standards of training and production that the imperial patronage made possible were substantially higher than anything achievable in a commercially organized theatre operating without state subsidy. The ballerinas of the Imperial Ballet occupied a specific social position in the world of the Romanov court, not quite of the aristocracy, but closely associated with it, the recipients of gifts and patronage from Grand Dukes and members of the imperial family, whose relationships with the leading dancers were a consistent feature of the social world of the late 19th and early 20th century imperial court. Matilda Kshesynska, the prima ballerina who was the young Nicholas II's mistress before his marriage to Alexandra, and who subsequently became the mistress of Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich, and then of Grand Duke Andrei Vladimirovich, whom she eventually married, embodied this specific intersection of artistic achievement and aristocratic connection with a flamboyance whose specific character made her one of the most talked about figures in the social world of the last decades of the Romanov court. The revolution dispersed the imperial ballet's greatest talents across the world. Nijinsky, Pavlova, Karsavina, and Lifar all made careers in emigration, and through them disseminated the specific tradition of the Romanov court's most enduring cultural achievement to every city in the world that had a ballet stage. Fact 63. The Romanov summer residences, life beyond the Winter Palace. The summer residences of the Romanov imperial family, the series of palaces and estates to which the court migrated as the Saint Petersburg winters gave way to the long northern summer days, each offering a specific combination of natural setting, architectural magnificence, and recreational possibility that the urban winter palace could not provide, constituted a parallel world of imperial life, whose specific character revealed dimensions of the dynasty's self-understanding that the formal ceremonial of the winter court somewhat obscured. A world in which the rhythms of family life, outdoor recreation, and informal sociality played a larger role than the elaborate court protocol of the capital, and in which the specific humanity of the individuals behind the imperial titles was more visible than in the rigidly choreographed ceremonies of the Saint Petersburg season. Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar's village, 15 miles south of St. Petersburg, was the primary summer residence of the last Romanov rulers, and the specific setting in which Nicholas II and Alexandra conducted the most intimate dimensions of their family life. The Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, smaller and more intimate than the Great Catherine Palace nearby, was the Romanov family's preferred home, the building in which the children were born and raised, whose specific rooms have been described by those who visited in terms that suggest a domestic warmth unusual for a royal residence. The children's playrooms filled with toys and books, Alexandra's mauve boudoir whose specific color and whose specific clutter of family photographs and religious icons expressed her personality directly, Nicholas's study in which he received ministers and signed state papers surrounded by the family photographs that covered every surface. Peterhof, the complex of palaces and gardens on the Gulf of Finland, whose system of gravity-fed fountains, elaborate parterres and sea views represented the Romanov dynasty's most spectacular exercise in landscape design, was used by the family for state ceremonial occasions when the specific visual grandeur of the setting was required to communicate imperial magnificence to visiting foreign dignitaries and to the diplomatic community. The Livadia Palace in Crimea, the family's southern residence, rebuilt by Nicholas in a neoclassical Italian style completed in 1911, provided the warmth and the sea air that the doctors prescribed for Alexei's health and that the entire family found restorative after the cold and the formality of the northern capital. The family's time at Livadia, swimming in the Black Sea, hiking in the Crimean hills. Living with a relative informality that the Petrograd court's protocol would not have permitted, was the dimension of their lives that the surviving photographs capture most intimately. A family in white summer clothes on a terrace above the sea, apparently happy, apparently unconcerned, in a world that had not yet revealed how completely it was about to disappear. Fact 64. The Romanov men at war, a dynasty of soldier czars. The specific relationship between the Romanov dynasty and military life, the tradition of personal military service, military command, and the specific identification of imperial authority with military prowess that characterized the dynasty from its foundation to its collapse, was one of the most consistent threads running through 3 centuries of Romanov rule, and one whose specific expression ranged from the genuine military genius of Peter the Great and Alexander I's strategic determination to the ceremonial military culture of the later Romanov Tsars, whose relationship to actual combat was entirely symbolic, but whose investment in the appearance of military authority was no less intense for that. Peter the Great was the Romanov dynasty's most genuinely soldierly ruler in the modern sense, a man who participated personally in the battles of the Great Northern War against Sweden, who was wounded at the Battle of Narva, and whose specific interest in military technology and military organization extended to the most technical details of fortification, artillery, and naval architecture that he had studied during his European travels. Alexander I, whose strategic decision to refuse accommodation with Napoleon in 1812 and to pursue the war until French power in Europe was broken, was the most consequential single act of military political leadership in the dynasty's history, was personally present at the battles of Austerlitz and Borodino. Though his specific role in the operational direction of those battles was limited by his deference to his generals and by his recognition of the gap between his ceremonial position as supreme commander and his actual military expertise. The tradition of Romanov military service continued through the 19th century in the form of the Grand Duke's service in the Imperial Guard regiments, and in senior military commands, whose specific quality was sometimes obscured by the social considerations that influenced appointments in a system where connection to the dynasty was a significant factor in advancement. Nicholas II's specific decision to take personal command of the Russian army in September 1915 expressed the Romanov understanding that the dynasty's authority was most fundamentally military authority, and that identifying himself directly with the army's command was the appropriate response to the military crisis the war had produced. Even though his specific qualifications for operational command were those of a man who had spent his military career performing ceremonial functions rather than exercising genuine military leadership, and even though the specific political consequences of associating his person directly with the army's subsequent failures were the opposite of what he had intended. Fact 65. The Romanov correspondence, love letters and state papers. The private correspondence of the Romanov imperial family, the letters between Nicholas and Alexandra, the letters between the imperial parents and their children, the letters between Nicholas and his mother Maria Fedorovna, and the extensive correspondence between the imperial family and their European royal relatives, constitutes one of the most intimate documentary records of any royal family in the history of the modern world. A body of private writing that survived the revolution through a combination of chance, concealment, and the specific interest of subsequent governments in possessing materials that might be politically useful, and that has been progressively published and analyzed in the decades since the Soviet archives became accessible to Western historians. The correspondence between Nicholas and Alexandra, conducted in English, the language they shared most comfortably from their earliest courtship and maintained throughout their marriage, is the most historically significant of these exchanges. A body of letters covering approximately 23 years of marriage, from 1894 to 1917, whose specific emotional character reveals a marriage of genuine depth and genuine mutual devotion, whose specific qualities, the tenderness, the physical warmth, the specific intimacy of two people who had made each other their primary emotional world in the specific isolation of the imperial court, are palpable even through the formality of the written medium. Alexandra's letters to Nicholas are particularly revealing, voluminous, passionate, often urgent in their political interventions during the First World War period, when she was managing governmental affairs from Petrograd, while Nicholas was at military headquarters in Mogilov, and consistent in their specific emotional register. The devoted wife writing to the beloved husband with whom she was in complete spiritual union, whose judgment she trusted absolutely on questions of family and faith, and whose specific political instincts she spent the war's final years systematically overriding in the conviction that her own understanding of what the dynasty required, derived in significant part from Rasputin's counsel, was more reliable than the advice of the ministers and generals who surrounded him. The specific political consequences of this correspondence, the way in which Alexandra's letters channeled Rasputin's recommendations into Nicholas's decision-making through the medium of a wife's persuasion that he was temperamentally unable to resist, make it one of the most consequential bodies of private communication in the history of modern statecraft. Letters whose specific content helped determine the appointments and policies of the largest state in the world during the most critical period of its modern history. Fact 66. Fabergé, the man behind the masterpieces. Peter Carl Fabergé, born in Saint Petersburg on May 30, 1846, the son of a goldsmith of French Huguenot descent who had established a modest jewelry business in the Russian capital, educated in Dresden, Florence, and Frankfurt, who returned to St. Petersburg in 1864 to take over his father's workshop and transformed it over the following decades into the most celebrated luxury goods firm in the world, whose specific combination of extraordinary technical mastery and unlimited artistic imagination produced objects whose quality has never been surpassed in the history of decorative arts, was the individual most responsible for the specific material culture of the late Romanov court. The man whose firm created not only the imperial Easter eggs, but the extraordinary range of objects, cigarette cases, picture frames, flower studies, animal carvings, decorative objects of every description, whose specific quality made the Fabergé name synonymous with the highest standard of craftsmanship achievable in precious and semi-precious materials. The House of Fabergé at its peak employed approximately 500 craftsmen, goldsmiths, enamelers, gemsetters, engravers, stone carvers, working in specialized workshops that were organized around the specific technical requirements of different materials and techniques, with each workshop headed by a master craftsman of exceptional skill who was responsible for the quality of everything produced under his direction. The specific technical achievement of the Fabergé workshops, The guilloche enamel work, whose translucent colored surface over a mechanically engraved base, creates an effect of depth and luminosity that no subsequent production has equaled. The hardstone carvings in nephrite, obsidian, rhodonite, and rock crystal, executed with a precision that modern jewelers find difficult to explain given the tools available. The miniature flowers in precious metals, whose petals of enamel over gold, achieve an organic naturalism that photographs suggest cannot be produced by mechanical means, reflected the specific combination of unlimited financial resources, unlimited time, and the specific perfectionism of a master craftsman who understood that in the absence of any commercial pressure to reduce costs, the only standard was the highest achievable. Fabergé fled Russia after the revolution, died in Lausanne in 1920, and left behind a body of work whose specific quality ensures that it will be studied, collected, and celebrated as long as the human capacity for admiring extraordinary craftsmanship endures. Fact 67. The Romanov dynasty and the Orthodox Church, sacred authority. The relationship between the Romanov dynasty and the Russian Orthodox Church, the specific theological, political, and ceremonial bond between the imperial family and the ecclesiastical institution that provided the primary ideological justification for autocratic rule, and whose specific ritual life was inseparable from the rhythms of the imperial court's ceremonial year, was one of the most fundamental structural features of the Russian imperial system, and one whose specific character distinguished the Romanov political order from every other major European monarchy in the degree to which religious authority and political authority were fused in a single figure and a single institutional complex. The Tsar's specific religious authority in the Russian imperial system was not identical to the medieval European concept of divine right of kings, but was in some respects more extensive. The Tsar was not merely appointed by God, but was understood in Russian Orthodox theology as God's anointed representative on earth, bearing a specific sacred responsibility for the spiritual welfare of the Russian people that made the exercise of autocratic power not merely a political right but a religious duty. Peter the Great's abolition of the Patriarchate of Moscow in 1721, replacing the Patriarch with the Holy Synod, a collegial body of bishops under the supervision of a lay official appointed by the Tsar, the Oberprocurator, brought the Church directly under state control in a way that had no equivalent in any other Orthodox country, and that transformed the Russian Church from an institution with its own independent authority into effectively a department of state whose senior appointments were controlled by the imperial government. The specific consequences of this subordination were profound. It deprived the Church of the institutional independence that might have allowed it to serve as a brake on imperial excess, or as an advocate for the social concerns of the peasant population that formed the overwhelming majority of its congregation. And it created the specific conditions in which the Church's moral authority was identified with the regime's political authority in ways that made the credibility of both vulnerable to the same political challenges. Nicholas II's intense personal orthodoxy, his daily religious observance, his genuine faith in divine providence as the guide of his political decisions, and his specific conviction that his autocratic authority was a sacred trust whose surrender would be a sin against God, was both sincere and politically consequential, providing the theological framework within which his resistance to constitutional reform made sense to him even when its political consequences were becoming catastrophically clear. Fact 68. The Romanovs and European royalty, a family of kings. The specific network of dynastic connections that linked the Romanov family to virtually every royal house in Europe by the final decades of the 19th century, connections established through the systematic marriage of Romanov Grand Duchesses and Grand Dukes into the royal families of Germany, Britain, Denmark, Greece, Romania, and other states, and through the corresponding marriage of European royal princesses into the Romanov family, created a web of kinship whose specific political character was at once more and less consequential than the dynastic strategists who constructed it had intended. More consequential because the specific personal connections between royal cousins who shared holidays, corresponded regularly, and retained the specific emotional warmth of family relationships, created informal channels of diplomatic communication that bypassed the formal diplomatic services, and that sometimes influenced political decisions in ways that official history has been slow to fully acknowledge. Less consequential because the specific structural forces of nationalism, industrial competition, and the alliance systems that produced the First World War proved overwhelmingly more powerful than any amount of family connection in determining the behavior of European states in moments of genuine crisis. The specific relationship between the Romanov dynasty and the Hohenzollern dynasty of Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II was Nicholas II's cousin, and the two exchanged extensive personal correspondence in the years before the First World War, illustrated this tension with particular clarity. The personal relationship between the two emperors was genuine, and in some moments appeared to hold the potential to influence the political decisions of their respective governments. And yet when the crisis of July 1914 developed, the specific logic of the alliance systems and the specific political pressures on both rulers produced the war that both men had exchanged telegrams claiming to want to prevent. Nicholas's specific telegram to Wilhelm on July 29, 1914, "An ignoble war has been declared on a weak country. The indignation in Russia shared fully by me is enormous. I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure forced upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war," was the communication of a man trying to use a personal relationship to prevent a political catastrophe that the impersonal forces of the international system were already making inevitable. The family connection did not save the peace. It did not save Nicholas either. Fact 69. The Romanov cultural patronage, a dynasty of collectors. The Romanov dynasty's role as patron of the arts, the specific combination of state funding, personal collecting, and institutional support through which the Tsars and their family members accumulated one of the greatest art collections in the history of the world, and built the cultural infrastructure of a civilization that aspired to rival, and in some respects surpass the artistic achievements of Western Europe, was one of the most consequential dimensions of the dynasty's historical legacy. Producing in the Hermitage Museum, and in the collections housed in the imperial palaces, a body of cultural achievement, whose specific quality has outlasted every political regime that has governed Russia since the dynasty's end. Catherine the Great's art collecting, conducted through purchasing agents in every major European city, with an energy and a discrimination that astonished her contemporaries, established the foundation of the Hermitage collection in a period of approximately 30 years, during which she acquired approximately 4,000 paintings, including some of the greatest masterpieces then available on the European market. She purchased the collection of the Berlin merchant Johann Gutskowski in 1764, acquiring approximately 225 paintings including works by Rubens, Rembrandt, Van Dyck and Hals. She purchased the collection of the French banker Pierre Crozat in 1772, adding approximately 400 paintings including Raphael's, Giorgione's and Titian's that remain among the Hermitage's greatest treasures. She purchased the collection of Robert Walpole from Horton Hall in 1779 in a transaction that provoked outrage in Britain, where it was felt that the national patrimony was being sold to a foreign autocrat. By the end of her reign, she had assembled a collection of approximately 4,000 paintings, 10,000 drawings, 10,000 engraved gems, and hundreds of thousands of books and manuscripts, housed in the buildings adjacent to the Winter Palace that she called her Hermitage, her place of retreat, and that she furnished and organized with the specific personal attention of someone who understood herself to be not merely accumulating objects, but building a civilization. The subsequent editions of Alexander I, Nicholas I, and Alexander III extended and deepened the collection, and the Hermitage that the Revolution inherited was one of the 3 or 4 greatest art museums in the world, a specific achievement of the dynasty's cultural ambition that the Soviet state preserved and the Russian state maintains today as the most significant cultural legacy of the 300-year Romanov experiment. Fact 70. The Romanovs at 70, 30 facts from the end. 70 facts into the story of the Romanovs, and the full human and historical dimensions of the dynasty are visible in all their complexity and all their contradictions. The dynasty that ruled Russia for 304 years produced in that span the most dramatic territorial expansion in the history of any state, the most concentrated accumulation of artistic wealth in any single royal collection, the most consequential series of reform and counter-reform cycles in the history of European governance, and the most catastrophic dynastic collapse of the modern era, ending not in the gradual erosion of a medieval institution, rendered obsolete by changing circumstances, but in the murder of a family in a basement by the representatives of an ideology that the dynasty's own failures had helped to create. The 30 facts that remain will carry us through the deeper human stories that the dynasty's political history has necessarily overshadowed, the specific lives of the remarkable individuals who inhabited the Romanov world, the cultural achievements that the dynasty's patronage made possible, the specific character of imperial Russian life as it was experienced by those who lived it at every level of the social hierarchy it created. through the question that the entire story ultimately poses with the specific urgency of a civilization whose end was both catastrophic and entirely avoidable. The Romanovs built something extraordinary. They failed to maintain it in the face of the specific demands of the modern world, and in their failure they produced the specific conditions for a catastrophe: the Soviet Union, the Gulag, the Terror, whose human cost dwarfed even the suffering of the imperial period they had presided over. Understanding what they built, what they failed to preserve, and what their failure produced is one of the essential tasks of anyone who wishes to understand the 20th century. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 71. The Romanov kitchens, feeding an empire's court. The kitchens and the dining culture of the Romanov imperial court, the elaborate infrastructure of cooks, confectioners, sommeliers, and household staff, whose collective labor produced the meals that the imperial family and their guests consumed at the extraordinary range of occasions that the court's ceremonial calendar required. From the intimate family dinners at which Nicholas read aloud, and the children argued about their lessons, to the great state banquets, at which several hundred guests were served simultaneously, in choreographed displays of imperial hospitality, whose specific organization required weeks of preparation, constituted one of the most revealing windows into the specific texture of Romanov daily life. The particular combination of genuine family warmth and absolutely non-negotiable magnificence that characterized everything about the dynasty's domestic existence. The kitchens of the Winter Palace employed approximately 1,000 people in peak season: cooks, sous cooks, pastry chefs, bread bakers, coffee makers, ice cream makers, wine stewards, silver polishers, and the extraordinary corps of specialists whose function was the maintenance of the porcelain services whose specific history tracked the dynasty's cultural aspirations. The Imperial Porcelain Factory, established by Elizabeth in 1744 as the second European porcelain manufacturer after Meissen, produced over the following century and a half a series of services: the Rafdil service, the Gothic service, the Guriev service, whose specific quality and whose specific historical significance as records of the court's aesthetic preferences at specific moments in its history have made them among the most sought-after objects in the history of decorative arts collecting. State banquets at the Winter Palace were organized around a service protocol of extreme elaboration. Courses were announced by the sound of drums and trumpets from the galleries above, served simultaneously to all guests by liveried footmen who moved in choreographed unison, accompanied by wines selected from a cellar whose contents represented the finest productions of every major European wine region. The food itself combined the French haute cuisine that Peter the Great had introduced as the appropriate culinary language for a European great power with specific Russian dishes: borscht, blini, kulibiak, whose presence on the imperial menu reflected the dynasty's specific negotiation between its European cultural aspirations and its Russian national identity. Nicholas II's own tastes were, by the standards of the court, relatively simple. He preferred straightforward Russian food, was moderate in his consumption of wine, and found the elaborate ceremonial of the great banquets a duty to be performed rather than a pleasure to be savored, a preference that reflected his broader discomfort with the public performance of imperial magnificence that the role required. Fact 72. The Imperial Guard, the dynasty's protectors. The Imperial Guard, the elite military units that served as the Romanov dynasty's personal military household, whose specific function combined the ceremonial role of providing the visible display of military power that the dynasty's public appearances required with the operational role of providing the armed force that protected the imperial family and, in moments of political crisis, determined which claimant to power the army would support, was one of the most politically consequential institutions of the entire Russian imperial system, the specific military body whose loyalty or disloyalty had decided the outcome of every major succession dispute and coup attempt in the dynasty's 300-year history. The Guard regiments, the Preobrazhensky, the Semyonovsky, the Horse Guards, the Chevalier Guards, and a dozen other elite units whose specific histories were intertwined with the dynasty's own, were recruited from the Russian nobility and from the most physically imposing specimens of the peasant population, trained to the highest military standard, housed in barracks adjacent to the imperial palaces, and maintained at a level of material comfort and institutional prestige that made service in the Guard one of the most sought-after positions available to the Russian officer class. Their specific political role in the Romanov system had been demonstrated repeatedly. It was the Preobrazhensky regiment's support that had enabled Catherine I to succeed Peter the Great, the Guard's backing that had brought Elizabeth to power in 1741, and the Guard's acquiescence that had made Catherine the Great's coup of 1762 possible. The specific reversal of this pattern the Guards' mutiny against the dynasty during the February Revolution of 1917, when the Petrograd garrison troops ordered to fire on demonstrating workers instead joined them, was the single most consequential military event of the revolution, the moment at which the dynasty lost the specific instrument of force that had sustained it through every previous crisis. When the Volinsky Regiment mutinied on February 27, 1917, shooting their commanding officer and marching to the State Duma, they ended in a single morning the specific military relationship between the dynasty and its armed protectors that had been the foundation of Romanov power since the dynasty's first decade. Fact 73. The Romanov Children's Education, Preparing Heirs and Duchesses. The education of the Romanov imperial children, the systematic program of instruction in languages, history, mathematics, music, religious knowledge, and the specific practical skills that their positions required, delivered by a succession of tutors whose selection was a matter of considerable political sensitivity, given the specific influence that the educators of future rulers inevitably exercised, was one of the most carefully managed dimensions of the dynasty's institutional life, and one whose specific character in the case of the last imperial family reveals the particular combination of genuine intellectual engagement and specific social isolation that shaped the personalities of the 5 children whose lives the revolution consumed. The last imperial children were educated primarily at home, a choice that reflected both the specific security considerations that made the public education of the heir to the Russian throne impractical and the specific preference of Alexandra for keeping her children within the protective environment of the immediate family circle. The educational program was conducted by a small team of permanent tutors, supplemented by visiting specialists. Pierre Gilliard, the Swiss tutor who taught French and who remained with the family through their captivity, and who wrote one of the most sensitive and most historically valuable memoirs of the family's final years. Sidney Gibbs, the English tutor, and a succession of Russian teachers who covered history, literature, and Orthodox religious instruction. The Grand Duchesses were educated in the traditional accomplishments of aristocratic women, languages, music, drawing, needlework, combined with a more substantial intellectual curriculum than the social assumptions of the period would have strictly required, a reflection of Alexandra's own intellectual seriousness and of Nicholas's genuine respect for his daughter's minds. Alexei's education was complicated by his hemophilia. The physical episodes that could confine him to bed for weeks at a time disrupted the continuity of his studies in ways that his tutors managed with the specific patience that the circumstances required. The education of the last imperial children produced intelligent, well-read, multilingual young people whose specific qualities, the practical competence, the emotional resilience, the genuine warmth toward the people they encountered, are consistently attested by the accounts of everyone who knew them in captivity, and whose specific tragedy is that those qualities had no world in which to be exercised. Fact 74. The Romanovs and photography, a dynasty photographed. The Romanov imperial family's enthusiastic embrace of photography, the technology that transformed the documentation of private and public life in the second half of the 19th century, and that the last Romanov family adopted with a specific amateur enthusiasm that produced one of the most extensive surviving photographic records of any royal family in the history of the medium, created the specific visual archive through which the dynasty's last generation is most immediately known to the contemporary world, and whose specific character, the informality, the genuine warmth. The evidence of a family life that was in many respects remarkably ordinary, given its extraordinary circumstances, has shaped the emotional relationship of subsequent generations to the dynasty's human story more powerfully than any formal portrait or official image could have achieved. Alexandra was particularly devoted to photography. She maintained a darkroom and developed her own prints, carried cameras on family excursions, and captured the specific moments of daily life that official court photographs never recorded. The resulting archive, thousands of photographs covering the family's life from the earliest years of the marriage through the captivity at Tsarskoye Selo, includes images whose specific intimacy is almost startling in a family of their rank. Nicholas roughhousing with his daughters on the deck of the imperial yacht, Alexei playing with his dog, the Grand Duchesses in nurses' uniforms at the military hospitals where they worked during the war, the family in matching sailor suits on holiday in Crimea. The specific photographic record of the captivity period, which the family maintained throughout their imprisonment, continuing to photograph each other and the guards and the garden of the Ipatiev house, provides one of the most poignant documents of the dynasty's end. A family that maintained the specific practice of domestic life right to the edge of its destruction, recording in photographs the last normal moments before the end. The final photographs of the family, taken at Tsarskoye Selo in the early weeks of their captivity under the provisional government, show them gardening and walking with a normality that makes the knowledge of what followed almost unbearable to hold simultaneously with the images themselves. Fact 75. The Romanov Navy and Empire at Sea. The Imperial Russian Navy, founded by Peter the Great from nothing in the final years of the 17th century, as the specific instrument of his ambition to make Russia a maritime power capable of operating in the Baltic and eventually in every ocean, built up through enormous investment of state resources and the specific importation of Dutch and English naval expertise, and developed over the following 2 centuries into the 3rd largest navy in the world by the early 20th century, was one of the most consequential Romanov institutional achievements, and the one whose specific catastrophic failures in the Russo-Japanese War most directly exposed the specific gap between the dynasty's imperial pretensions and the organizational reality of the state apparatus attempting to sustain them. Peter's creation of the Russian Navy from scratch in the years between 1696 and 1725 was among the most remarkable organizational achievements of his remarkable reign. He began by ordering the construction of a fleet on the Don River to support operations against the Ottoman fortress of Azov, learned shipbuilding personally during his European travels, established the shipyards at Voronezh, Archangel, and eventually Saint Petersburg, recruited thousands of foreign naval officers and craftsmen, and created within 30 years a fleet capable of defeating the Swedish Navy at the Battle of Ganga in 1714. The first significant Russian naval victory in history. The subsequent development of the Russian Navy reflected the specific challenges of a power whose coastlines were divided among 3 non-connecting seas, the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Pacific, with no warm water port whose access was not controlled by a potentially hostile foreign power, a geographical constraint whose specific consequences shaped Russian naval strategy and Russian foreign policy throughout the Romanov period. The destruction of the Russian Pacific Squadron at Port Arthur and the annihilation of the Baltic Fleet at Tsushima in 1905. The specific military disasters that ended the Russo-Japanese War in humiliation was the most concentrated single expression of the organizational and technological gap that Nicholas II's governance had failed to close between Russia's self-image as a great power and the actual capability of its military institutions. Fact 76. The Romanov romances, love and marriage in the dynasty. The romantic and marital lives of the Romanov dynasty, the specific intersection of personal feeling, dynastic calculation, and the rigid protocol of European royal marriage markets through which the Tsars and Grand Dukes selected their wives, and the Grand Duchesses were selected as the wives of other dynasties' sons, constituted one of the most humanly revealing dimensions of the imperial family's existence. Offering in the specific stories of individual Romanov, marriage is the particular drama of human feeling constrained and shaped by institutional requirements, whose specific force varied with the rank of the individuals involved and the political circumstances of the moment. The marriage of Nicholas II and Alexandra was, within the specific context of dynastic royal marriage, an unusually genuine love match. They had first met as children. Nicholas had been immediately captivated by the 12-year-old Alex of Hesse at their first meeting in 1884, and he had maintained through the subsequent years of intermittent contact and his father's reservations about the match, a devotion that Alexandra reciprocated once she had overcome her reluctance to leave her German home and convert to Orthodoxy. The specific letters exchanged during their courtship, charged with a romantic feeling whose specific intensity reflected the particular combination of emotional restraint and passionate attachment that both their temperaments inclined them toward, established the emotional register of a marriage that remained through 23 years and 5 children genuinely central to both their lives, and whose specific quality, the complete mutual absorption, the shared religious intensity. The specific world within a world that the family created was simultaneously one of the most attractive things about the last Romanov family and one of the factors that most severely limited Nicholas's political effectiveness, by making the specific concerns of the family circle the primary emotional reality against which the demands of the wider political world were measured and too often found to be less pressing. Fact 77. The Romanovs' favorite places, sacred landscapes. The specific places that held the deepest personal significance for the last Romanov family, the landscapes, the buildings, and the natural environments that the family returned to year after year, and that accumulated through repeated visits, the specific emotional resonance of places that had witnessed important events that were associated with particular people, and that represented in their physical character something essential about the specific quality of life the family was attempting to protect and maintain, were a geography of private meaning, whose contours can be traced through the family's letters, diaries, and the photographic archive they maintained with such consistent devotion throughout their time together. The Finnish skerries, the archipelago of granite islands and inlets along the Finnish coast, where the imperial family spent weeks each summer aboard the imperial yacht Standard, swimming in the cold, clear water, hiking across the bare granite outcrops, fishing, and living in the specific informal simplicity that the yacht's enclosed world permitted away from the court's ceremonial demands, were described by every member of the family and every participant in those voyages as the period of greatest happiness and greatest freedom in the entire year. The officers of the Standard became the family's closest friends outside the immediate household. The specific camaraderie of the long summer days in the Finnish skerries produced relationships whose genuine warmth was one of the few sources of authentic human connection that the dynasty's specific isolation from ordinary social life permitted. Spala, the imperial hunting lodge in Russian Poland, was the site of the most frightening episode of Alexei's hemophilia, when a severe internal hemorrhage in October 1912 brought the boy to the apparent edge of death, and whose specific emotional impact on the family, the terror of watching him suffer without being able to help, the specific despair of understanding that this could happen again at any moment, deepened the emotional dependence on Rasputin that was already shaping the dynasty's political life. The family's specific attachment to these places, the Finnish skerries, the Crimean coast, the Tsarskoye Selo gardens, gives the story of their captivity and murder a specific quality of geographical loss as well as human loss. Not only the deaths of specific people, but the specific destruction of the relationship between those people and the places that had given their lives its particular texture. Fact 78. The Romanov legacy in music, a dynasty that inspired masterpieces. The musical legacy of the Romanov dynasty, the extraordinary body of music whose creation was made possible by imperial patronage, whose specific subjects or occasions were provided by the dynasty's ceremonies and its history, and whose composers drew on the specific emotional and cultural world of imperial Russia for the material of their greatest achievements, constitutes one of the most substantial artistic inheritances of any ruling family in the history of the modern world, and one whose specific quality reflects the particular combination of Russian cultural depth and imperial financial resources that the dynasty's patronage made available to the composers who worked within and around its institutional framework. Tchaikovsky's relationship to the Romanov dynasty, mediated primarily through his association with the Imperial Ballet and the Imperial Opera, both of which commissioned and premiered his most celebrated theatrical works, produced in Swan Lake, The Sleeping Beauty, The Nutcracker, and Eugene Onegin, 4 of the dozen or so most frequently performed large-scale musical works in the history of classical music, works whose specific musical character, the specific combination of melodic generosity, orchestral brilliance, and the particular emotional directness that Tchaikovsky brought to every project he undertook, has made them accessible to audiences with no prior experience of classical music, in a way that no amount of critical advocacy could have achieved independently of the music's intrinsic quality. Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition, Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade, Borodin's Prince Igor, the works of the nationalist Russian school that coalesced in Saint Petersburg in the second half of the 19th century, drew on the specific cultural resources of Russian folk music, Russian history, and the specific landscape of the Russian land in a creative synthesis whose results placed Russian music at the center of the European musical conversation for the first time. Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony, composed during the siege and performed in the besieged city by an orchestra so weakened by hunger that military musicians had to be brought in to complete the ensemble, extended the tradition of Russian music's response to historical catastrophe into the Soviet period that the revolution had produced. A testimony to the specific depth of a musical culture whose foundations the Romanov dynasty had laid, and whose continuity the revolution could disrupt but not destroy. Fact 79. The Romanov legacy in literature, writers of the imperial age. The literary culture of the Romanov imperial period, the extraordinary efflorescence of Russian prose, poetry, and drama that occurred during the 19th and early 20th centuries, producing in the approximately 100 years between Pushkin's first publications in the 1820s and the Revolution of 1917, a body of literature that by any standard of measurement constitutes one of the greatest national literary traditions in the history of the world, was shaped by the dynasty's patronage, constrained by its censorship, nourished by its social world as subject matter, and ultimately transcended by its greatest writers in ways that made Russian literature the specific domain in which the contradictions of the Romanov system were most honestly examined and most powerfully expressed. Alexander Pushkin, the poet whom Russians have never ceased to regard as the supreme expression of their language's expressive potential, whose verse novel Eugene Onegin and whose prose tales established the specific forms and the specific emotional register of the Russian literary tradition, worked throughout his career under the specific double pressure of Nicholas I's personal censorship, which the Tsar exercised directly on Pushkin's manuscripts, and the specific social world of the imperial court, which Pushkin navigated as a man of letters, whose genius was recognized, but whose personal independence was resented by the aristocratic establishment that surrounded him. His death in a duel in 1837, defending the honor of his wife against an officer of the imperial court, was experienced by the Russian reading public as a murder, the specific destruction of the greatest creative talent of the age, by the specific social pressures of the aristocratic world that the Romanov dynasty had created. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Chekhov, the writers who shaped the literary tradition after Pushkin, each engaged in specific ways with the specific social realities of the Romanov imperial system, its class hierarchy, its serf economy, its official religion, its specific forms of human suffering. Their engagement with these realities produced a literature of extraordinary moral seriousness, and the specific quality of that seriousness, the refusal to look away from suffering, the insistence on the full humanity of every character regardless of social station, is one of the most enduring legacies of the culture that the dynasty produced, and that the dynasty's own institutions often attempted to suppress. Fact 80, the Romanovs at 80, 20 facts from the end. 80 facts into the story of the Romanovs, 20 facts from the end, and the dynasty's full presence in the world it made is visible in every dimension. In the palaces that still receive their millions of visitors each year, in the music that the dynasty's patronage made possible, and that fills concert halls and ballet theatres across the world, in the literature that the dynasty's social world provided with its subject matter, and that its censorship apparatus attempted to contain, in the religious tradition of the Russian Orthodox Church that the dynasty controlled, and that eventually canonized its last family as saints. The 20 facts that remain will complete the story, not with the murder, which has already been told, but with the deeper questions that the murder and everything that preceded it continue to pose. What the dynasty meant for the people who lived under it, what it means for the Russia that carries its legacy in architecture and music and literature and religious tradition, and what it means for any civilization that attempts to understand how a ruling family of genuine achievement and genuine historical significance can also be, simultaneously, the specific obstacle to the reforms that might have allowed the civilization they built to survive. The Romanovs built something extraordinary. They built it on foundations that were morally compromised from the beginning: the serf labor, the political repression, the specific exclusion of the Russian people from any meaningful participation in the governance of the state their taxes and their labor sustained. Understanding both of these truths simultaneously, the grandeur and the cruelty, the cultural achievement and the human cost, is the specific intellectual and moral challenge that the Romanov story poses to every generation that encounters it. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 81, the Romanov jewels, treasure dispersed across the world. The imperial jewels of the Romanov dynasty, the accumulated treasure of 3 centuries of imperial gift-giving, dynastic inheritance, and the specific acquisitive energy of rulers who understood precious stones and precious metals as the most concentrated material expression of the power and permanence that their dynasty claimed, constituted at the time of the revolution one of the largest and most historically significant collections of gems and jewelry ever assembled in private hands. And their specific fate in the years following 1917, the concealment, the looting, the smuggling, the auction sales, and the eventual dispersal across the collections of museums and private buyers across the world, is one of the most consequential stories in the history of the decorative arts. The Soviet government, which inherited the imperial jewelry collection following the revolution and the murder of the family, organized a systematic sale of the collection's contents throughout the 1920s and 1930s as a means of generating the foreign currency that the isolated Soviet economy desperately needed. Cartier in Paris acquired significant portions of the collection. Christie's and other auction houses sold individual pieces. Private buyers from across Europe and America purchased items whose specific provenance, the crown jewels of the Romanov dynasty, made them objects of historical significance as well as aesthetic and financial value. The 7 imperial crowns, the imperial scepter and orb, and a number of other coronation regalia were retained in the Soviet state collections and are today displayed in the Kremlin armory, providing visitors with the most direct surviving encounter with the specific material magnificence of the Romanov ceremonial world. The jewels that Alexandra and her daughters had sewn into their corsets during the captivity, the specific diamonds and pearls whose concealment had been intended to provide financial resources for an escape or an exile that never came, were discovered when the executioners stripped the bodies after the murder, the gem's deflection of the initial bullets having prolonged the killing in ways whose specific horror was recorded in Yurovsky's subsequent account. The specific dispersal of the Romanov jewels across the world's collections, from the Louvre to the Smithsonian to private hands in London and New York, is both the material record of a dynasty's end and the specific mechanism by which the most tangible objects of the Romanov world have been preserved and made accessible to a world that the dynasty itself could not have imagined. Fact 82: The Romanovs and the Jews, a history of persecution. The specific relationship between the Romanov dynasty and the Jewish population of the Russian Empire, the approximately 5 million Jews who lived within the Pale of Settlement, the western borderlands of the empire, to which Jewish residence was legally confined by imperial decree, and whose specific experience of the Romanov state combined legal discrimination, periodic violence, and the specific administrative contempt of a government that regarded its Jewish subjects as a problem to be managed rather than a population to be governed, was one of the most consequential and most morally damning dimensions of the dynasty's historical record, and one whose specific legacy in the form of the mass emigration of Russian Jews to Western Europe and the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries shaped the cultural and political landscape of the receiving societies in ways that continue to be felt. The Pale of Settlement, established by Catherine the Great in 1791 and maintained with modifications through the remainder of the dynasty's existence, confined the empire's Jewish population to a specific geographical zone in the western borderlands, prohibiting residence in Moscow, Saint Petersburg, and the interior of the empire except for specific categories of Jews, merchants of the First Guild, university graduates, craftsmen practicing specific trades, who were permitted to reside outside the Pale under conditions of continuing legal discrimination. The specific violence of the pogroms, the organized or semi-organized attacks on Jewish communities that occurred with increasing frequency and severity in the final decades of the dynasty, from the pogroms of 1881 to 1884 that followed Alexander II's assassination to the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 to the waves of violence during the Revolution of 1905, was carried out by non-Jewish populations with the specific acquiescence or active encouragement of local authorities whose attitude toward Jewish suffering ranged from indifference to complicity. Nicholas II's personal antisemitism, expressed in private correspondence and in the specific receptivity he displayed toward the fraudulent protocols of the Elders of Zion, which he read and initially endorsed before being persuaded by advisors that it was a forgery, represented a specific personal dimension of the institutional antisemitism that pervaded the Russian state, and whose consequences for the Jewish population of the empire were real and persistent throughout his reign. Fact 83: The Romanov dynasty's final years, the court in crisis. The specific character of the Romanov imperial court in the dynasty's final decade, the years between the 1905 revolution and the February Revolution of 1917, in which the political pressures generated by industrialization, the war, and the specific failures of Nicholas II's governance created a social atmosphere of anxiety, factional conflict, an accelerating dysfunction whose specific dimensions have been documented in extraordinary detail in the memoirs of the court officials, aristocratic observers, and foreign diplomats who witnessed them, was one of crisis managed with the specific techniques of a court culture whose primary response to external pressure was the intensification of its own internal ceremonial life, as though the maintenance of the forms of imperial splendor could substitute for the substance of effective governance. The diplomatic memoirs of the period, the accounts of French, British, and German ambassadors who attended the imperial court's functions in these years, describe a social world whose surface brilliance was visibly disconnected from the political reality of the empire it represented. Balls and receptions of undiminished magnificence in a capital whose workers' districts were on the verge of revolutionary explosion. Dinner parties at which the conversation avoided the subjects that everyone present understood were the only subjects that mattered, and a court whose specific internal dynamics, the factionalism around Alexandra and Rasputin, the specific tension between the imperial family and the Romanov Grand Dukes, who were publicly critical of Rasputin's influence, were the subject of obsessive discussion in the drawing rooms of the aristocracy, while the actual governance of the empire deteriorated in the absence of stable ministerial leadership. The specific social world of the Romanov court in these final years has been described by those who inhabited it as simultaneously beautiful and unreal. A civilization maintaining the performance of its own magnificence with the specific intensity of something that understands on some level that the performance is what remains when the substance has already been lost, and that the moment the performance stops, everything will become visible at once. Fact 84. Stolypin's reforms and their legacy, the road not taken. The agrarian reforms initiated by Pyotr Stolypin between 1906 and 1911, the program of legislation that allowed peasants to withdraw from the communal land system of the Mir and consolidate their holdings into individual hereditary farms that provided state credit for the purchase of additional land. And that was intended to create, within a generation, a class of prosperous peasant smallholders whose material stake in the existing order would constitute a conservative social force capable of stabilizing the empire against revolutionary pressure. Represented the most serious and the most historically significant attempt to address the specific structural weakness of the Russian rural economy that the dynasty's governance had created and failed for decades to resolve, and whose interruption by Stolypin's assassination in 1911 removed from the Russian political scene the specific combination of vision and will that reform required. The specific agricultural results of the Stolypin reforms in the 5 years between their implementation and the outbreak of the First World War were encouraging by any measurable standard. Approximately 2.5 million peasant households had taken advantage of the legislation to separate from the commune and consolidate their land by 1915. Agricultural production was increasing. And the specific social differentiation of the countryside, the emergence of the prosperous kulak class, whose development the Mir's communal leveling had previously inhibited, was producing the rural middle class that Stolypin had identified as the necessary foundation for political stability. The First World War disrupted the reform process before it had run long enough to determine whether Stolypin's fundamental vision, that 20 years of internal peace would transform Russia beyond recognition, was correct or optimistic. The specific question of what Russia would have become had Stolypin lived, had the reforms continued for another decade, and had the First World War not intervened to shatter the institutional framework within which the reforms were operating, is one of the most genuinely consequential counterfactual questions in modern history. The specific road not taken, whose exploration reveals most clearly the specific mechanisms by which the dynasty's collapse was not inevitable, but chosen. At each turning point, through the specific failures of individual human judgment. Fact 85. The Romanov children in captivity, ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances. Specific experience of the 5 Romanov children during the 18 months of their captivity, from the February Revolution of March 1917 to the murder of July 1918, encompassing the house arrest at Tsarskoye Selo, the exile in Tobolsk, and the final confinement in Yekaterinburg, was one that their specific characters and their specific upbringing equipped them to manage with a resilience and a grace that has consistently impressed the historians who have studied it. Children who had been raised to find their primary social world within the family, and who discovered that the specific confinement of captivity, by removing the few social connections that the imperial court's isolation had permitted, concentrated that family world into an intensity of mutual support that the specific circumstances of their situation simultaneously demanded and made possible. The 4 Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, adapted to captivity in ways that reflected their individual personalities. Olga's intellectual melancholy, already present before the revolution, deepened under the specific weight of what she understood about their situation. Tatiana's practical efficiency found expression in the management of the household's daily routine. Maria's warmth extended characteristically to the guards, several of whom she befriended in ways that briefly complicated the Bolshevik command's management of the captivity. And Anastasia's specific comedy, the irrepressible humor that had characterized her since childhood, continued to express itself in the specific forms available in a confined space, through amateur theatricals, through the mimicry of guards whose mannerisms she observed with the specific attentiveness of a natural comedian. The girls cut each other's hair when it became infested with lice during the Tobolsk winter. They performed plays in the evenings. They continued their lessons. They wrote letters to friends that were never delivered and received letters from outside that were read by their captors before reaching them. They maintained, in circumstances designed to be dehumanizing, the specific human qualities, the humor, the warmth, the intellectual curiosity that their upbringing had developed and that no captivity could entirely suppress. Fact 86. The Imperial Yacht Standard, a floating palace. The Imperial Yacht Standard, the 4,500-ton steam yacht launched in Copenhagen in 1895 that served as the primary recreational vessel of the last Romanov family, one of the largest private yachts in the world at the time of its construction, and the specific floating environment in which the family experienced the greatest freedom and the greatest happiness of any period in their lives together, was a world unto itself. A vessel whose specific design combined the navigational capability of a seagoing ship with the domestic comfort of a private house, and the specific social atmosphere of a community of approximately 500 officers, crew and household staff who lived in sufficient proximity to the family to become, over the years of repeated voyages, something closer to extended family than to employees. The Standart's annual summer cruises through the Finnish skerries, the archipelago of granite islands, pine forests and crystalline water along the Finnish coast, where the family spent weeks each summer, anchoring in quiet coves and living with an informality impossible anywhere else in the imperial world, were described by every member of the family and everyone who participated in them as the happiest periods of their year. The specific freedom of the skerries cruise, the ability to swim and fish and hike without the ceremonial demands of the court, the specific social intimacy of a closed community whose members knew each other through years of shared experience, the beauty of the northern summer landscape with its long twilights and its particular quality of light, gave the family the specific experience of ordinary life that their position otherwise made inaccessible. The officers of the Standard, many of them young men of the Imperial Guard's social background, who spent weeks in close proximity to the imperial family year after year, became the only people outside the immediate household whom the children knew as genuine friends rather than as subjects or officials. The photographs from the Standard cruises are the most relaxed and most genuinely happy images of the last Romanov family that survive. A family in white summer clothes on a sun-warmed deck, apparently simple, apparently free, apparently unaware that the world they inhabited was already, beneath its surface, irreversibly changing. Fact 87, the Romanov Art Collection, 3 centuries of accumulation. The art collection assembled by the Romanov dynasty over 3 centuries of imperial patronage and acquisitive collecting. The paintings, sculptures, decorative objects, manuscripts, coins, weapons, and natural history specimens that filled the palaces and the museum buildings of Saint Petersburg, Moscow, Tsarskoye Selo, and the other imperial residences, was by the early 20th century one of the most extensive and most historically significant accumulations of art and cultural objects ever assembled under a single institutional authority, and its specific composition reflected in its variety and its depth the successive aesthetic preferences and collecting strategies of the successive rulers whose contributions had built it into the institution that the revolution inherited. Peter the Great's collecting conducted with the same systematic energy he brought to every project, acquiring coins, curiosities, anatomical specimens, and scientific instruments, as well as paintings and sculptures during his European travels, and through agents he maintained in Holland, England, and Germany, established the institutional habit of the Romanov ruler as universal collector, gathering not merely the conventional prestige objects of royal collecting, but the full range of natural and human knowledge in its material form. Catherine the Great's purchases, the Tsarskoye collection, the Crozat collection, the Walpole collection, and hundreds of individual works acquired through agents whose instructions were to purchase the finest available examples of every major school and period, transformed the collection from a cabinet of curiosities into a genuine museum of world art. Alexander III's specific preference for Russian art led to the systematic acquisition of works by the Wanderers, the realist painters of the late 19th century, whose subjects were drawn from Russian rural and urban life, that formed the foundation of the Russian Museum established in Saint Petersburg in 1898, providing the dynasty with a national art collection distinct from the universal collection of the Hermitage. The Soviet government's inheritance of this accumulated treasure, its decision to maintain the Hermitage as a public museum, while selling portions of the collection to generate foreign currency in the 1920s and 1930s, preserved the institutional achievement while dispersing a significant portion of its contents. In a specific historical irony that placed Romanov treasures in the private collections of American industrialists at the moment when the revolution was proclaiming the abolition of private property. Fact 88, the Romanovs and the Church, faith as foundation. The specific character of the Romanov dynasty's religious faith, the Orthodox Christianity that was simultaneously the dynasty's personal spiritual practice, the ideological foundation of its political authority, and the specific institutional relationship with the Russian Church that Peter the Great had transformed from a partnership of equals into a subordination of the ecclesiastical to the imperial. shaped every dimension of the dynasty's existence, from the coronation rituals that inaugurated each reign to the daily prayers that bookended the private life of every emperor and empress, and whose specific quality in the last imperial family represented both the most genuine and the most politically consequential expression of Romanov religious conviction in the dynasty's entire history. The coronation of Nicholas II in May 1896, the ceremony conducted in the Dormition Cathedral of the Moscow Kremlin, according to a ritual whose specific form had been established by Peter the Great's reform of the coronation liturgy, and whose specific elements, the anointing with holy oil, the placing of the imperial crown, the emperor's communion in both kinds as a special mark of his sacred status, expressed in liturgical form the specific theological claim of the Romanov autocracy to divine appointment, was the most visible single expression of the dynasty's religious self-understanding. Nicholas participated in the ceremony with a specific seriousness, whose personal sincerity was genuine, and whose political consequence was the renewal, at the beginning of his reign, of the specific theological commitment to autocracy as a sacred trust that would make constitutional reform feel, to him, like a betrayal of his anointing. Alexandra's conversion to orthodoxy, described in her own accounts as a genuine spiritual transformation rather than a diplomatic accommodation, produced in her a faith of unusual intensity whose specific character, combining orthodox mysticism with the specific vulnerability of a convert's passionate commitment to the tradition she had chosen, made her susceptible to the particular form of religious charisma that Rasputin embodied. The dynasty's faith was real. Its consequences were political. Its final expression was the specific courage with which each member of the family faced their deaths in Yekaterinburg, the prayers, the crosses, the religious objects carried in their clothing, a faith maintained to the end in circumstances that tested it beyond anything its possessors had imagined when they first professed it. Fact 89, the Romanov Memoirs, Witnesses to a Lost World. The body of memoir literature produced by those who knew the last Romanov family, the accounts of tutors, courtiers, guards, household staff, diplomatic observers, and surviving family members who recorded their specific memories of the dynasty's final years, constitutes one of the richest documentary records of any royal family's private existence in the history of the modern world, and one whose specific value derives precisely from the variety of perspectives it encompasses. The French tutor's careful observation, the guard's revolutionary contempt gradually complicated by specific human contact, the lady-in-waiting's aristocratic grief, the physician's professional assessment inflected by personal attachment, each providing a different angle of vision on the same human reality. Pierre Gilead's memoir, published in 1921 under the title 13 Years at the Russian Court, written by the Swiss tutor who had educated the children and who had accompanied the family through their captivity until the final transfer to Yekaterinburg, from which he was separated, and they were not, is the most comprehensive and the most carefully observed of the eyewitness accounts. Distinguished by the specific intellectual honesty of a man who had loved the family without illusion, and who recorded what he had seen with the specific precision of someone aware that his account would be the primary evidence for dimensions of the family's experience that no official record would preserve. Anna Vyrubova's memoir, written by Alexandra's most intimate friend, the lady-in-waiting whose specific closeness to the empress made her the primary human conduit of Rasputin's influence into the court, provides from its specific perspective of passionate personal loyalty an account of the empress's private life whose specific details, colored by the memoirist's adoration, nonetheless preserve information available nowhere else. The memoir of the guard Anatoly Yakimov, one of the Ipatiev house guards who testified in 1919 before the White Army investigator Nicholas Sokolov, provides from the opposite perspective the specific texture of the family's final confinement as witnessed by a man whose specific task was their imprisonment, and whose account of the family's daily behavior, the politeness, the dignity, the maintenance of routine, was given by someone whose institutional role should have precluded the sympathy it actually conveyed. Fact 90, the Romanovs at 90, 10 facts from the end. 90 facts into the story of the Romanovs, 10 facts from the end, and the dynasty's full presence in the world it created, and the world that destroyed it is visible in all its dimensions. The jewels dispersed across the world's collections and the imperial yacht's summer photographs, the pogroms and the ballet, the palaces and the basement, the memoirs of the tutor who loved the children, and the testimony of the guard who watched them. The canonization in the cathedral built on the site of the murder, and the DNA identification that confirmed what the murderers had hoped to conceal forever. All of these are the specific forms in which the Romanov story continues to inhabit the world 307 years after the family's election to the throne, and more than 100 years after their murder. The 10 facts that remain will close this story, not by resolving the questions it raises, which do not resolve, but by honoring the full weight of what was built and what was lost, the full complexity of a dynasty whose achievements were genuine and whose failures were catastrophic, and the specific human beings at its center whose specific lives and specific deaths the passage of a century has made no less consequential and no less poignant. The palaces are still standing. The church is still receiving its pilgrims. The Fabergé eggs are still in their museum cases, their miniature surprises still opening to the curious fingers of the visitors who turn the tiny golden keys. The story of the Romanovs is still being written by the historians, the novelists, the filmmakers, and the ordinary people who stand before the church on the blood in Yekaterinburg and try to hold in their minds simultaneously what was built here and what was ended here, and what the distance between those two things tells us about the specific fragility of everything that human beings construct. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 91. The Romanovs in the First World War, the war that broke everything. The specific role of the First World War in the Romanov dynasty's collapse, not merely as the military context within which the revolution occurred, but as the specific catalyst that compressed into 3 years the specific social, political, and economic pressures that might otherwise have taken decades to reach the critical threshold at which the dynasty's institutional inadequacies became impossible to sustain, is the dimension of the Romanov story that most directly connects the intimate human drama of the last imperial family to the vast historical forces of the early 20th century that were transforming every European civilization simultaneously. Russia's entry into the war in August 1914 was greeted with a surge of nationalist enthusiasm whose specific character, the spontaneous demonstrations in the major cities, the renaming of Saint Petersburg to the more Russian-sounding Petrograd, the temporary cessation of the strike movement, gave the government and the dynasty a brief period of political unity that was the specific opposite of what the war would produce in its subsequent years. The Russian army's performance in the war's first year revealed with painful clarity the specific gap between the enormous human resources of the empire, the largest army in the world by number of men mobilized, and the organizational and industrial capacity required to equip, supply, and command that army effectively in a war of industrial attrition against the most technically advanced army in Europe. By the summer of 1915, Russian infantry were being sent into combat without adequate rifle ammunition, and in some units without rifles at all, a material failure so extreme and so publicly known that it generated the specific political crisis, the progressive bloc in the Duma demanding a government of public confidence, that Nicholas met by proroguing the Duma and taking personal command of the army himself. The specific political logic of Nicholas's decision to take personal command connected every subsequent military defeat directly and personally to the Tsar, simultaneously removing him from Petrograd and leaving Alexandra and Rasputin to manage the government in his absence, a combination of decisions whose specific political consequences, the ministerial leapfrog, the accelerating loss of institutional legitimacy, the specific contempt that the Russian political class developed for a dynasty that appeared to be governing through a mystic and an empress, made the February Revolution less a sudden shock than the specific outcome that the decisions of 1915 had made increasingly probable with each passing month. Fact 92. The White Army Investigation, Sokolov's Search for Truth. The investigation of the Romanov murders conducted by the White Army investigator, Nicholas Sokolov, appointed by Admiral Kolchak's government in February 1919, after the White Army had occupied Yekaterinburg, and the initial investigations of the execution site had already been conducted by Sokolov's predecessors, and who conducted the most thorough forensic investigation of the crime available until the discovery of the burial sites in the post-Soviet period, was one of the most painstaking and most professionally executed criminal investigations of its era, producing a body of evidence and a set of conclusions that the subsequent centuries' additional discoveries have largely confirmed rather than contradicted, and that established the basic factual framework within which every subsequent account of the dynasty's end has operated. Sokolov gathered testimony from dozens of witnesses, guards, household staff, local officials, railway workers, and others who had knowledge of the events of July 1917, and conducted physical examination of the Ipatiev house, the surrounding area, and the Four Brothers mine site where initial body disposal had been attempted, recovering fragments of bone, teeth, buttons, corset hooks, and personal possessions, including a fragment of Alexandra's glasses and Alexei's belt buckle, that established the specific physical evidence of what had occurred. His conclusions that all 11 members of the Romanov household had been murdered in the basement of the Ipatiev house on the night of July 16 to 17, 1918, that their bodies had been transporting to the forest outside the city, that disposal by burning and acid had been attempted and partially successful, and that the remains had been buried in the forest, were published in his 1924 book The Murder of the Romanov Family. Completed after he had fled Russia with his evidence following the White Army's defeat and published posthumously, since Sokolov died in France in 1924 before seeing it in print. The specific value of Sokolov's investigation was not only the evidence it gathered, but the specific seriousness with which it was conducted, the professionalism of a trained investigator, applying systematic forensic methods to a crime whose perpetrators had gone to considerable lengths to conceal, producing a record that proved, in the most essential dimensions, accurate. Fact 93. The Russian Orthodox Church and the Romanov legacy, saints and pilgrims. The process by which the Russian Orthodox Church moved from the Soviet periods enforced silence on the subject of the last imperial family through the cautious rehabilitation of the post-Soviet transition to the formal canonization of Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children in August 2000, and the specific pilgrimage culture that the canonization has generated in the century since the murders. Centering on the church on the blood in Yekaterinburg and on the monastery established at Ganina Yama, where initial body disposal was attempted, is one of the most revealing examples of the specific ways in which the Romanov story has been absorbed into Russian national and religious identity in the post-Soviet period. The canonization was not without genuine theological debate within the church. The question of whether Nicholas's record as a ruler, his authorization of force against civilian demonstrators, his governance failures, his specific responsibility for the conditions that produced the revolutionary crisis, was consistent with the category of passion bearer, whose requirement is not a saintly life but a Christian death, generated sustained discussion among bishops and theologians who were aware of the political dimensions of the decision as well as its theological ones. The specific resolution, the designation of passion bearer rather than martyr, acknowledging the Christian character of the family's deaths without canonizing the political record of the reign, represented a careful balance between theological precision and the specific popular devotion that had already attached itself to the last imperial family in the years following the Soviet collapse. The church on the blood in Yekaterinburg, built on the site of the demolished Ipatiev house and completed in 2003, has become one of the most visited religious sites in Russia, drawing pilgrims from across the country and from Russian Orthodox communities worldwide. On the night of July 16 to 17 each year, tens of thousands of pilgrims walk in procession through the city to the church, arriving at the site of the murders at the hour of the killings, in a ceremony of commemoration whose specific scale and whose specific emotional intensity express something genuine about the place the Romanov story occupies in the contemporary Russian national consciousness, a place that is simultaneously religious, nationalist, and deeply personal in ways that resist easy categorization. Fact 94. The Romanov descendants today, a living dynasty. The Romanov family's surviving descendants, the several hundred individuals who carry Romanov blood through the various branches of the dynasty that survived the revolution, scattered across the countries of Europe and the Americas in the century following the dynasty's collapse, and who have maintained in varying degrees of formality the specific dynastic identity and the specific dynastic claims that the revolution abolished but did not extinguish, constitute today a living connection to the dynasty whose human reality is more complex and more varied than the romantic narrative of the émigré Romanov would suggest. The primary dynastic claim is maintained by the Grand Duchess Maria Vladimirovna, the daughter of Grand Duke Vladimir Kirillovich, the grandson of Kirill Vladimirovich, who had proclaimed himself emperor in exile in 1924, who lives in Madrid and maintains the Imperial House of Russia as a dynastic institution with its own protocol, its own charitable activities, and its own engagement with the Russian state that has been, since the fall of the Soviet Union, gradually normalized into a relationship of mutual recognition without any political content of monarchical restoration. Maria Vladimirovna's specific position as the primary claimant is contested by other members of the Romanov family, several dozen princes and princes who descend from the dynasty through male lines other than the Kirillovichi, and who dispute the legitimacy of the Kirillovichi claim on grounds of the specific dynastic regulations of the imperial house. The Romanov Family Association, the broader organization of Romanov descendants that includes members of multiple branches and that takes no position on the succession question, has been more actively engaged with the Russian state in the post-Soviet period, participating in the reburial ceremonies of the identified remains and in other commemorative events that mark the dynasty's specific presence in contemporary Russian public life. The question of whether the Russian monarchy might be restored discussed periodically in Russian political culture, but never seriously advanced as a political program, has remained theoretical, and the Romanov descendants have generally been careful to maintain their engagement with Russia in cultural and charitable, rather than overtly political terms. Fact 95. The Romanov story in film and literature, an endless fascination. The specific fascination that the Romanov story has exercised over the cultural imagination of the century since the dynasty's end, generating an extraordinary volume of novels, films, theatrical works, operas, television series, and other cultural productions that have engaged with the dynasty's history and mythology from every conceivable angle and in every conceivable genre, is one of the most striking examples of a historical event's transition from lived experience to cultural inheritance, and one whose specific character reveals both the universal dimensions of the Romanov story and the specific cultural needs that different moments and different audiences have brought to their engagement with it. The Anastasia narrative, the story of the surviving princess whose identity might or might not be concealed in an amnesiac woman in a Berlin hospital, was the specific cultural thread that dominated the Romanovs' fictional life through most of the 20th century. From Marcel Mauret's 1952 play through the 1956 film with Ingrid Bergman, through the 1997 animated film, and the subsequent Broadway musical, whose cheerful anachronisms and deliberate historical liberties have introduced the Romanov story to a generation whose relationship to it is entirely mediated through entertainment rather than historical knowledge. The serious literary engagements with the Romanov story, Anthony Summers and Tom Mangold's investigation The File on the Tsar, Robert Massey's Nicholas and Alexandra, and his subsequent The Romanovs. The final chapter, Helen Rappaport's The Romanov Sisters, have provided for each successive generation the most accessible and the most carefully researched accounts of the dynasty's history. And the specific achievement of this body of historical narrative in making the human dimensions of the Romanov story accessible to general readers without distorting the historical record represents one of the most valuable services that popular history writing has performed for any period of modern history. The Romanovs continue to be written about, filmed, and dramatized because the story they embody, the fall of a dynasty, the murder of a family, the survival of a legend, contains within it the specific combination of historical consequence and intimate human drama that makes any story both important and irresistible. Fact 96. Saint Petersburg, the city the Romanovs built. Saint Petersburg, the city that Peter the Great ordered built on the marshy delta of the Neva River in 1703, that he made the capital of the Russian Empire in 1712, that served as the imperial capital until the Revolution of 1917, and that became Petrograd and then Leningrad before reverting to its original name in 1991 in a popular vote whose specific symbolic content. The choice to restore the name of the city's Romanov, founder in preference to the Soviet name that honored Lenin, expressed something important about the post-Soviet Russian relationship to the imperial past, is the most tangible and most comprehensive physical legacy of the Romanov dynasty. A city whose entire existence is a monument to the specific ambition, the specific aesthetic vision, and the specific organizational will of the family that created it. Peter's decision to build a new capital on the swampy shores of the Baltic, in a climate of brutal cold and summer floods, on ground that required millions of wooden piles to stabilize the foundations of the buildings that would be constructed on it, at a location accessible to the European sea routes that Peter understood Russia needed to dominate, was the most consequential single act of city planning in the history of the modern world. The creation from nothing of a city that within a century would contain more than 500,000 people, and that would be recognized as one of the great architectural achievements of European civilization. The specific architectural character of Saint Petersburg, the Baroque palaces of the early period, the neoclassical public buildings of the late 18th century, the empire style of the Alexandrine period, reflects in its accumulated layers the successive aesthetic preferences of the successive Romanov rulers, whose courts shaped the city's growth and whose patronage funded its most significant buildings. The Neva embankments at white night, the weeks of midsummer when the northern sky never fully darkens, and the Baroque and neoclassical facades of the palaces are reflected in the river's grey water, are among the most beautiful urban vistas in the world, and they are a Romanov creation, a dynasty's specific ambition made permanent in stone and water and the peculiar northern light. Fact 97. The Romanovs and Russia today, a story still being negotiated. The specific place of the Romanov dynasty in contemporary Russian national identity, the way in which the last imperial family and the dynasty's 300-year history are remembered, evaluated, and politically instrumentalized in the Russia of the 21st century, is a dimension of the Romanov story that is still actively in development, shaped by the specific political culture of the post-Soviet state, by the Russian Orthodox Church's canonization of the last family, by the gradual opening of Soviet archives that has allowed a more complete historical picture to emerge, and by the specific political needs of a Russian state that has found in the imperial past both a source of national pride and a complex inheritance whose most uncomfortable dimensions, the autocracy, the repression, the specific failures of governance, are in uncomfortable resonance with the specific political culture of the present. The rehabilitation of the Romanov legacy in post-Soviet Russia has proceeded on multiple fronts simultaneously. The restoration of imperial-era place names and monuments, the reconstruction of destroyed churches and palaces, the return of confiscated religious objects, and the specific public ceremonies, the reburial of the identified remains, the annual Yekaterinburg pilgrimage, that have given the Romanov memory a visible presence in contemporary Russian public life. The specific political use of the Romanov legacy, the selective emphasis on the dynasty's achievements, and the corresponding minimization of its failures, the specific identification of the Orthodox, Christian imperial tradition as the authentic expression of Russian national identity against the Soviet period's interruption of that tradition, reflects the particular ideological needs of a Russian political culture that has found in the imperial past a source of national narrative whose specific content supports the specific political values of the contemporary state. The Romanov story, in other words, is not only a story about the past, it is a story that the present is still writing, for reasons that have as much to do with contemporary political needs as with historical truth. Fact 98. The Romanov tragedy, what it means. The specific meaning of the Romanov tragedy, the murder of Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children in a Yekaterinburg basement in July 1918, considered not merely as a historical event whose specific circumstances have been established by forensic investigation and archival research, but as a moral and human phenomenon whose significance extends beyond the specific individuals who died to encompass the specific civilization they represented, and the specific questions their deaths posed to every generation that inherits the world their dynasty built and their revolution transformed, is a question that resists the simple answers that the 2 dominant frameworks for understanding it typically provide. The framework of dynastic tragedy, the Romanovs as essentially sympathetic figures whose personal virtues are emphasized, whose political failures are minimized, and whose deaths are understood primarily as the victimization of innocence by revolutionary brutality, captures the human reality of 5 murdered children and a family whose specific domestic warmth is genuinely documented, while minimizing the specific political and social failures of the reign that created the revolutionary conditions from which the murders emerged. The framework of revolutionary justice, the Romanovs as representatives of a class system whose exploitation of the Russian people made some form of violent reckoning inevitable, whose deaths were the logical conclusion of a historical process they had refused to guide and refused to accommodate, captures the real social grievances and the real political failures, while minimizing the specific moral reality of murdering children and obscuring the specific relationship between the Bolshevik murders and the subsequent decades of Soviet mass killing. The honest engagement with the Romanov tragedy requires holding both frameworks simultaneously, acknowledging the specific human reality of the family's deaths and the specific political reality of the dynasty's failures, and refusing the comfort of either the purely sympathetic or the purely judgmental response that the story's specific emotional charge makes available. Fact 99. The Romanov burial, a century to come home. The specific process by which the remains of the last Romanov family, murdered in July 1918, concealed in the Ural forest for 7 decades, discovered in 1979 and officially excavated in 1991, identified by DNA analysis by 1994, and reburied with state ceremony in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in Saint Petersburg in July 1998, finally came to rest in the imperial crypt that had held the remains of every Russian emperor since Peter the Great, and the specific human dimensions of that 80-year journey from basement to burial constitute one of the most powerful symbolic narratives in the entire history of the dynasty. The story of a family's physical remains, denuded a grave for most of a century, and finally restored to the specific resting place of their predecessors and their tradition. The reburial ceremony of July 17, 1998, held on the 80th anniversary of the murders, was attended by President Boris Yeltsin, who delivered a speech acknowledging the murders as one of the greatest crimes of the Soviet period and expressing the specific hope that the reburial would contribute to national reconciliation. The Russian Orthodox Church did not officially participate in the ceremony, maintaining its position that the identification of the remains required further study before the Church could confirm that these were indeed the last Romanovs, a position that has been sustained for the 25 years since the reburial, and that reflects the specific theological and political complexity of the Church's relationship to the Romanov legacy. The grave of Nicholas and Alexandra, their 3 daughters, and the members of their household now lie in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, in a chapel adjacent to the grave of Alexander III and Alexander II, in the imperial necropolis that has held the Romanov dead since Peter the Great. The grave of Alexei and Maria, identified from the second burial site in 2007, have not yet been interred with the rest of the family, pending resolution of the Church's position on the identification. The family is together, almost. The bureaucracy of death has not entirely finished with them yet. Fact 100, the Romanovs, a story that will not end. 100 facts into the story of the Romanovs, and the story, as all stories about the most consequential events in human history, does not end with the 100th fact any more than it began with the first. The dynasty that built the largest empire in the history of the world, and was consumed by a revolution whose conditions its own governance had helped to create. The family that lived in palaces of extraordinary beauty and died in a basement of absolute squalor. The children who maintained their humor and their warmth and their specific humanity in confinement, and who were murdered before they had lived long enough to understand what had been taken from them. All of these are still present in the world they shaped, in ways that are visible if you know where to look. The Winter Palace still stands on the Neva embankment, its turquoise and white facade receiving the northern light that Peter the Great brought his dynasty to this specific location to face. The hermitage behind its walls contains 3 million objects assembled by the Tsars and their empresses over 3 centuries of collecting, whose energy and discrimination produced one of the greatest cultural institutions in human history. The ballets that Petersburg created for the imperial stages are performed every night in some opera house somewhere in the world, the specific choreography and the specific music outlasting by more than a century the institution that commissioned and sustained them. The Fabergé eggs are in their cases, still beautiful, still opening to their miniature surprises when the tiny golden keys are turned. The church on the blood in Yekaterinburg receives its pilgrims. The grave in the Peter and Paul Cathedral receive their flowers. And on the night of July 16 to 17 each year, tens of thousands of people walk through the streets of a city that was called Sverdlovsk for 60 years and is now called Yekaterinburg again, carrying candles in the dark, walking toward the site of a murder that happened 100 years ago and that the world has not finished with yet. Close your eyes, breathe slowly. The Romanovs built something extraordinary from a frozen swamp on the edge of the European world, and they lost it in a basement 3 centuries later. And the distance between those 2 facts is the entire story of what human beings are capable of: the glory and the ruin, the beauty and the brutality, the specific grandeur of civilization, and the specific fragility of everything that civilization constructs. This has been explored during sleeping.